Welcome back to Mr. Bellico, where the American wilderness keeps its darkest secrets, and the old folklore never truly sleeps. I'm your guide through these forgotten trails, where park rangers have seen things no report can explain, and where something ancient still watches from between the trees. Before we step into tonight's story, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? I want to know who's brave enough to walk these woods with me tonight. And if you're new to Mr. Belcho, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You don't want to be caught alone in the dark when the next story drops. Now, dim the lights, lock the doors, and let's step beyond the tree line. The smell is what I remember most vividly, not the darkness that pressed in from every direction that October night, not the wet leaves that clung to my face, not even the sound, that wet clicking sound in the back of the something's throat. It was the smell, like roadkill mixed with wet dog and something chemical, something like cleaning supplies mixed with spoiled meat. That smell is permanently burned into my nervous system. Sometimes I catch it in my sleep. My name doesn't matter anymore. I've been a ranger in the Appalachian regions for 12 years, worked Shenandoah, spent 3 years in the Cherokee National Forest, and for the last 5 years I've been stationed in the northern Appalachians where the mountains get mean, where the laurel thickets grow so thick that sunlight never reaches the forest floor. That's important context for what happened. The night it started, I was doing a routine patrol around the Blue Ridge area, checking on some reported illegal camping near Cataract Falls. It was 10:47 p.m. I remember checking my watch under the beam of my flashlight. The air was cold. That bone-deep October cold that makes you remember why winter kills things. I'd hiked out maybe 3 miles from my truck, following a trail that winds through some of the densest, most disturbing sections of the park. The laurel thickets here are unlike anything most people have ever seen. They grow so close together that their branches interlock, creating walls of vegetation that look almost deliberately placed. Rangers have a saying, "The laurel knows when you're looking for trouble." I didn't believe it then. The illegal campsite wasn't hard to find. A small clearing that someone had definitely used more than once. Blackened rocks in a fire ring, trash scattered about, which made me angry. People are the worst. And a half-collapsed tent. No sign of people currently, but the site felt recent. 3 days old, maybe 4. That's when I smelled it the first time. Not the full smell yet, just a hint of it. Like something dead, but not fresh dead. Old dead. I've encountered plenty of carrion in my 12 years. Deer, raccoons, once a black bear that didn't make it through a hard winter. But this was different. This didn't smell natural. There was something acrid about it, something that made my lizard brain scream to leave. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I radioed in that I'd found the camp, documented it, and that I was heading back out. Standard procedure. My colleague Torres back at the station didn't see anything unusual in my voice. I didn't sound scared. I was just starting to be scared. The walk back to my truck should have taken 40 minutes. I made it about a mile when I heard the sound. Not loud, not at first. Just something moving through the brush off to my right, paralleling my path. Too big to be a deer, too coordinated to be a distressed animal. The sound was deliberate. Whatever it was stalking the trail, keeping pace with me about 30 yards into the trees. I stopped walking. I stopped breathing, practically. The sound stopped too. This is where it gets hard to explain because I'm a rational man. I'm educated. I've taken ranger certification courses. I've been trained in wildlife behavior. I understand predator-prey dynamics. I know what bears sound like, what mountain lions sound like. Yes, we still have them, despite what Fish and Wildlife says. What moose, elk, wild boar, all of it. I know the sounds that animals make. What came next wasn't any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was a call. That's the only way I can describe it. A sound like someone was trying to scream and laugh simultaneously, but from a throat that wasn't designed for human vocalization. It went up in pitch, then down, then up again, and underneath it all was that wet, clucking sound, like a swallow trying to vocalize, like a dog with its windpipe partially crushed, trying desperately to bark. My hand went to my service pistol. I didn't draw it, but I touched it. That reflexive action probably saved my life, because the second my fingers made contact with the grip, everything went quiet. Not the quiet of an empty forest, the quiet of something holding its breath, of something waiting to see what I would do. I drew my pistol, 9mm Glock 22, standard issue. I've never fired it at anything except the range. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. "Park Service?" I shouted. My voice cracked. "Identify yourself." The forest didn't respond. Even the wind had died. I started walking backward, keeping my flashlight pointed toward where I'd heard the sound. My gun was up, both hands, the way I'd been trained. I was walking backward along a trail in the dark forest at nearly 11 o'clock at night, which was stupid. So stupid. But fear makes you stupid. I'd made it about 30 yards backward when my heel caught on a root. I went down hard, landing on my ass, my flashlight spinning away into the darkness. My gun flew from my hands, another stupid thing. I should have kept it. But when you fall, you instinctively grab for something to catch yourself. The darkness that enveloped me when that flashlight landed and went out was absolute. Appalachian darkness is different from other darkness. It's not just an absence of light. It's thick. It presses against you. I've read in forums online about other people who've gone into those mountains at night and described that exact same sensation. Darkness that feels like a living thing. I was on my hands and knees trying to find my gun when I heard it again, but it was closer, much closer. The smell came with it, that acrid, wrong smell that made my sinuses burn and my stomach clench. Roadkill and wet dog and spoiled meat and something chemical, like formaldehyde, like the smell in a biology lab. All of it at once. Then I heard its breathing. This is the part where most people online who share their stories say something like, "I heard it breathing, and I always thought they were exaggerating or being poetic." But they weren't. Breathing is a signature. You can hear the shape of an animal's lungs in how it breathes. This thing's breathing was irregular, wet, like there was fluid in its throat, like it wasn't breathing through its nose but through its mouth, and its mouth was full of something that shouldn't be there. I got to my feet and I ran. I ran blind into the forest, away from the trail, and I'm pretty sure I was screaming. All my training went out the window. All my professional composure evaporated. I ran like prey animals run. Pure panic, pure survival instinct. Branches tore at my face and hands. I could taste blood in my mouth, whether from my lips being cut or from running into something I don't know. Behind me I could hear it following, and it wasn't running. It was moving fast, but not with the frantic speed of panic. It was moving with intention. Methodical. Hunting. I burst out of the tree line into a clearing. I'm not sure which clearing, somewhere I'd never been before, and I fell down a ravine. Rolled, tumbled, smashed my shoulder against a boulder. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I lay at the bottom of that ravine, gasping, tasting blood, unable to make sound even though my body wanted to scream. The sound stopped above me. I could hear it standing at the top of the ravine, breathing that wet, wrong breathing. In that moment, with my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs would break, I had a single crystal clear thought. It doesn't know where I am. I'm hidden in the darkness. I stayed absolutely still. I didn't breathe, didn't move. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. It must have been only 5 minutes, but time breaks when you're that afraid. It doesn't work right. Eventually the breathing stopped. The sound of it shifted. Not the sound of something leaving, the sound of something deciding to go elsewhere, a sound like satisfaction. I heard it move away through the trees, that wet clicking sound growing fainter. I stayed in that ravine for another hour, maybe 2 hours, I'm not sure. Eventually I got my hands steady enough to pull out my backup flashlight from my belt. Thank God I'd grabbed it automatically, muscle memory, and I was able to navigate back toward the trail. It took me until 3:30 a.m. to make it back to my truck. I didn't report the encounter that night. I sat in my truck with all the doors locked, the interior lights on, the engine running to keep the heater going, and I tried to convince myself that what I'd experienced was a bear, a very large bear acting unusually aggressively. But in my heart I knew it wasn't a bear. I didn't go back to work for 4 days. I told my supervisor that I had a migraine, that I needed rest. It was partially true. I had the worst headache of my life, had thrown up twice in that truck before I managed to drive back to town, and hadn't slept in those first 36 hours. When I finally did sleep, I had nightmares so vivid and horrifying that they were worse than being awake. But the real reason I didn't go back was because I was trying to understand what had happened to me. I'd been a skeptic of all the folklore stuff. The old-timers who worked at the ranger stations would tell stories sometimes, warnings about the mountains, about things that lived in the deep woods that weren't quite animals. I'd always dismissed it as local color, the kind of storytelling that develops around isolated communities. Old mountain superstitions. Now I was on my laptop at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, deep in Reddit forums and obscure paranormal websites, searching for stories that matched mine. The forums I found were full of similar accounts. Park rangers, hikers, hunters, and outdoorsmen from across the Appalachian regions reporting encounters with something that couldn't be easily categorized. Accounts of things that moved wrong, that smelled wrong, that called out in voices that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human. A lot of them used the term skinwalker. I knew about skinwalkers in a vague anthropological way. Native American folklore, primarily Navajo traditions, the idea of a person who could slip into the skin of an animal and use that form for nefarious purposes. But these weren't Navajo accounts. These were from the Appalachians. Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, North Carolina, Virginia, all the places where the laurel grows thick and the mountains still hold secrets. One particular thread caught my attention. A poster named Mountain Sentry who claimed to have been a ranger for 20 years and had encountered the same thing I described, or something very similar. His account was from 5 years ago, posted under a throwaway account, very careful and measured in his language. He described the smell exactly as I'd experienced it. He described the breathing, but he also described something I hadn't heard clearly, the vocalizations. He broke down the sounds into components. A bass tone that almost sounded canine, underlaid with something that sounded like human speech, twisted. He wrote, "It was like listening to a recording of someone screaming that had been slowed down and then pitch shifted. But underneath all that, I could swear I heard words. Not English words, but something trying to communicate." In the comments, dozens of people replied with their own stories. People from all across Appalachia reporting encounters that fit the same pattern. A man in West Virginia who encountered something that mimicked his daughter's voice, calling to him from the woods. He ran. Looking back, which he said he immediately regretted, he saw a shape in the darkness that was roughly the size and silhouette of a young girl, but it moved wrong. The joints bent in directions that human joints don't bend. A group of hunters in Kentucky who found evidence of a deer kill so wrong that none of them would describe the details in their post. One comment was just, "Whatever did it, it wasn't hunting for food. I've seen predator kills. This was something else." A ranger from Shenandoah National Park, my park, where I'd worked, who reported finding tracks that started as a canine paw print, gradually transitioned to something more humanoid with the posts, and then eventually became a human handprint, all in the same sequence in the mud. The ranger had quit after that encounter. Didn't stay in the system. The further I went into these forums, the more the evidence seemed to cluster around a specific pattern. These things were concentrated in the Appalachian region, the old mountains where the laurel thickets grow and where the land was never fully settled, only marginally inhabited. They seemed to hunt with intelligence. They seemed to be mimicking animals, or at least wearing animal shapes, and they seemed particularly active during autumn. One post, from a user called Deep Woods Lore, contained a historical element that made my blood go cold. He'd researched old colonial and pre-colonial records from the Appalachian region. There were accounts in some of the earliest English-language documents from settlers, mentions of something they encountered in the mountains that they referred to as the skinned thing, or the thing that wears shapes. They're scattered and incomplete, written in the language of the time, often couched in religious or demonic terminology. But the accounts are there. It could be, Deep Woods Lore wrote, that these things have been in these mountains since before written history. The Cherokee have their own traditions about creatures that wear skins. The Shawnee had stories. Even the Appalachian people themselves, the Scots-Irish who settled here, brought with them from the old country stories about things that lived in wild places and wore the shapes of animals. What if the landscape itself shapes what hunts in it? What if these mountains, oldest on the continent, have their own fauna that we simply haven't acknowledged? By the fourth day, when I finally called my supervisor and told him I was ready to come back, I had one clear objective. I needed to find out what I'd encountered, and I needed to do it carefully. I wasn't going to be that ranger who quit. I wasn't going to run screaming to the authorities with a story they'd never believe. Instead, I was going to use my position, my access, and my training to gather evidence. I was going to hunt it. October turned into November, and the weather in the mountains grew mean. I began filing detailed incident reports that my supervisor couldn't question, all ostensibly about wildlife management and unusual animal behavior. I started requesting to work the same general area where my encounter had happened, claiming I wanted to document any unusual predator activity around those specific trails. My supervisor, Dave, a good man who'd been doing this for 30 years, just looked at me with concern and approved my requests. He thought I was being extra diligent after my scare. He didn't question it. I set up camera traps in the areas where I suspected it moved. High-end wildlife cameras, motion-activated, that I'd requisitioned under the guise of documenting predator populations. I positioned them along trails and at places where I'd found signs. The signs were the thing that kept me going forward, because they were undeniable. Physical evidence. First, there were the tracks. I found the first ones about 3 miles from where my initial encounter had happened, pressed into the wet soil near a stream. The track started as a clear canine print, large, way too large. The pad impressions deeper and wider than any wolf or feral dog I'd ever seen documentation for. But as the track sequence moved forward, it changed. The prints gradually became less canine, more humanoid. By the 5th print in the sequence, it looked almost like a human footprint, except the toe articulation was wrong. The toes spread too wide and bent at angles that human toes simply don't bend. I photographed them extensively. I documented them in my incident report as unusual predator behavior. No one who read my reports would understand what they actually meant. The second sign was worse. A kill site. I found it in early November, about a mile off the main trail, deep in a laurel thicket. A deer, a young doe, positioned in a way that suggested ritual placement rather than a predator's natural kill. The carcass was arranged on its back, its legs positioned in a spread pattern that looked almost deliberate. The wound, and there was only one major wound, was on the throat, but it was wrong. The wound was too wide, the edges too jagged, like something with an impossibly large mouth had closed around the deer's neck and torn. But here's what made my stomach turn. Parts of the deer were missing. Not eaten, removed. Its eyes were gone, its tongue was gone, its heart and lungs had been excised and the cavity had been left open, posed. The smell at that site was overwhelming. That same acrid, wrong smell from the night of my encounter. I documented it, of course. Photos, measurements, GPS coordinates. Filed another report, but I didn't leave the site immediately. I stayed and watched for a while, sitting on a fallen log, waiting to see if whatever had done this would return. It didn't, but I felt it the way prey animals feel a predator in the vicinity, a pressure in the air, a sense of being observed from just beyond my sight line. The camera traps started yielding results in late October. Most of the footage was mundane: white-tailed deer, raccoons, the occasional bear, but scattered throughout there were fragments. Seconds-long clips where something large and dark moved past the camera in a way that the lighting or the angle prevented me from seeing clearly. Shapes that might have been canine or might have been something else. The clips were always blurry, always just at the edge of focus, as though the thing understood the cameras and deliberately moved in ways that would defeat them. Then, on November 4th, I got a clip that was different. The timestamp showed 11:43 p.m. The camera had captured something. A creature of some kind standing maybe 15 feet away, frozen in the moment before the camera's motion sensor had fully activated. The image was freeze frame, not video, but the quality was there. What I was looking at was covered in what appeared to be fur or hair. The body had an overall canine shape, four-legged, lean, muscular. But the head was wrong. It was too large for the body, and the head was angled toward the camera, and I could swear, even in that single freeze frame image, that it was looking directly at the lens, aware of it. The eyes caught some reflected light, and they reflected it wrong, not with the eyeshine of animal eyes, but with a kind of flat, dull absorption, like the light was being pulled into the eyes rather than reflected out. I must have stared at that image for 20 minutes. Every time I looked at it, I saw something new that disturbed me. The way the limbs articulated suggested a flexibility that canine anatomy wouldn't allow. The musculature seemed wrong, too dense in some places, too thin in others, like it was a patchwork of different anatomies sewn together. I downloaded the image and I studied it late into the night, and I came to a realization that terrified me more than anything else had. This thing was aware of me. It knew I was hunting it, and by documenting it, by pursuing knowledge of it, I was doing something that was changing its behavior. I was making it interested in me. November wore on, and my entire life became an obsession with understanding what lived in those mountains. I wasn't sleeping. I was running on coffee, energy drinks, and the kind of adrenaline that comes from pursuing something that should not exist but does. I was filing reports that made less and less sense to my supervisor, requesting more and more access to isolated areas, and spending 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day in the woods. Dave finally confronted me in mid-November. "You need to take some time off," he said, sitting across from me in his office. "Real time, not a few days, a week or two. You're losing weight. You're looking like hell. Whatever you're dealing with, this isn't it." I told him I was fine. I lied. The truth was that I'd found something else. A camp. Not a ranger station or a legitimate campsite. Something hidden deep in the laurel thickets, in an area so remote that I hadn't known it existed until I found it. It was positioned in a small clearing, surrounded by the dense thickets, and it had a very intentional architecture to it. There was what appeared to be a lean-to structure constructed from branches and bark, positioned in a way that provided shelter but minimal visibility from outside. There was a fire ring, but the ashes in it were old, weeks old at least. And there was a collecting of items, pieces of animal bone, carefully arranged in patterns, bundles of fur tied with strips of hide, a collection of teeth, canine teeth, but oversized, organized in careful rows. And at the center, almost like a shrine, was a collection of personal items: a watch, modern, probably stolen, a wallet with a Massachusetts driver's license inside, the photo showing a young man who'd been missing for 6 months according to an online search, a wedding ring, a child's shoe. This wasn't an animal's den. This was an intentional collection, a trophy collection, the kind of thing a hunter or a predator with human cognition would gather. The moment I understood that, I knew I was dealing with something that thought like we thought, something that understood ownership and value and remembrance, something that hunted us. I left that site and I should have reported it, should have called it in, brought other rangers, made it official. Instead, I documented it all on my personal camera and I walked away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the device steady. That night, I sat in my cabin, a small ranger station residence about 10 miles from the main station, and I tried to put together everything I knew. The forums had been full of speculation about what these things were. The most consistent theory, repeated over and over, was that they were something that didn't fit into any known taxonomy. Not quite human, not quite animal, something that existed in the margins, something that our current understanding of biology didn't have a place for. One poster, a user named Appalachian Scholar, had written a detailed post theorizing that these might be a remnant population of something prehistoric, perhaps a human subspecies that never quite died out, but adapted to the mountains, became more cryptid than human, developed hunting behaviors and a kind of biological plasticity that allowed them to mimic animal forms. The Appalachians are old mountains, he'd written, worn down but old. They've been inhabited for 12,000 years. What if in the deep places, in the laurel thickets where modern humans don't venture, something else developed, something that learned to hunt us and learned to do it cleverly? I believed it. I believed every word of it, and I think, on some level, I knew it believed in me too. The dream started on November 16th. I wasn't sleeping, but when I did manage to drift off, I had nightmares so vivid that they bordered on hallucinations. Dreams of running through the forest with something behind me. Dreams of that wet breathing sound getting closer and closer. Dreams of it catching me, and the sensation of teeth, wrong teeth, too many of them, puncturing my skin. But worse than the nightmares were the moments when I wasn't sure if I was awake. I'd be in my cabin at midnight, and I'd hear something outside. Branches breaking, the sound of something large moving through the brush. I'd go to the window, and there would be nothing. But the feeling of being watched would persist for hours after. On November 18th, I went to the camp where I'd set up the camera traps. I told my supervisor I was checking the cameras for maintenance. It was true, in a way. What I really wanted was to know what I was dealing with. How much of a threat was this thing? How intelligent was it? Was it hunting specifically for me, or would any human do? The answer came from the cameras. 17 new clips in 3 days. And in all of them, the thing was close. Too close. 12, 13, 14 feet away at maximum. In one clip, and this was the one that made me realize how much danger I was actually in, the creature had actually touched the camera, had pressed its face against it. I could see the shape of a head, covered in a mixture of fur and something that looked like exposed skin, and I could see the jaws open and there were too many teeth, rows of them like a shark's mouth but set into what should have been a mammalian skull. That's when I knew I couldn't do this alone anymore. That's when I knew I had to involve someone else. I reached out to an acquaintance I'd met at a ranger conference a few years back, Dr. Sarah Chen, who worked in the Department of Natural Resources in Charleston, West Virginia. She had a reputation for taking seriously the reports that other researchers dismissed. She'd published papers on predator behavior in the Appalachian region that were careful, scientific, but not dismissive of the unusual cases. I sent her an email with attachments, selected camera footage, the photographs of the tracks, descriptions of the kill sites I'd documented. I told her about the camp with the trophy collection. I did not tell her about my encounter or about the forums I'd been reading. I presented it all as a concerned ranger reporting unusual predator activity that didn't fit standard behavioral profiles. She called me 3 days later. "I want to see this in person," she said, no preamble. "Can you show me tomorrow?" Yes. Yes, I could. We met at first light on November 22nd, at a parking area near the most remote access point to the areas I'd been monitoring. Sarah brought equipment, a graduate student named Marcus, thermal imaging gear, a more sophisticated version of the wildlife cameras I'd been using, and a level of professional skepticism that I immediately appreciated and resented in equal measure. "Show me the kill site first," she said. We hiked in. It took about 40 minutes. I was nervous, more nervous than I'd been in months, not because Sarah was there, but because bringing another person into this felt like I was breaking some kind of barrier, like I was giving this thing permission to escalate. The kill site was still there. The deer carcass had decomposed quite a bit in the 3 weeks since I'd discovered it, but the arrangement was still apparent. Sarah photographed everything methodically. She collected samples. She examined the wound pattern with the kind of detached professional interest that made me want to scream. "Large predator," she said finally. "But the wound pattern is unusual, and this arrangement is atypical. It's not feeding behavior. It's more like a collection I finished for her." She looked at me sharply. "Like ritual behavior," she corrected. We moved on to the camp. Sarah's skepticism began to crack when we found it. She examined the trophy collection with a growing sense of alarm that mirrored my own. The personal items, the watch, the wallet, the wedding ring, the child's shoe, those were the killers. Those made it undeniably clear that whatever lived here was not just a predator, but something that hunted humans and collected their possessions as trophies. "We need to report this to law enforcement," Sarah said immediately. "Missing persons, possible serial predator." "And tell them what?" I interrupted. I felt something cold settle in my chest. That some unknown animal killed people and is collecting their belongings? That the kill sites don't match any known predator behavior? "Sarah, no one is going to believe this. They'll think we're insane." "Then we get more evidence," she said firmly. "We document everything. We set up proper monitoring. She stopped mid-sentence. The wind had shifted and I smelled it. That acrid, wrong smell. Roadkill and wet dog and spoiled meat and formaldehyde. Sarah smelled it too. I could see her nostrils flare as she caught the scent. "What is that?" she whispered. "Run," I said. "What?" "Run. Now. Don't ask questions. Run back toward the trail." She looked at me, trying to assess if I was serious. I'd never been more serious about anything in my life. The sound came from the laurel thickets to our left. Not the breaking branches sound of something crashing through the forest. The sound of something moving with deliberate, careful steps, hunting us. Sarah ran. I ran with her, and behind us the thing came. It didn't roar or snarl. It made that wet, clicking, laughing sound that was somehow worse than any roar could have been. The sound of something that understood it had caught prey and was delighted by the fact. We made it to the trail and we ran blind, branches tearing at us, my legs pumping harder than I'd ever pushed them in my life. I could hear it behind us, closer, always getting closer. The sound of its breathing, that wet, horrible breathing, mixing with our own ragged gasps. Sarah went down hard about 200 yards from the parking area. She tripped on a root and went sprawling. I grabbed her arm and hauled her up without stopping, and we crashed out of the forest onto the access road where Marcus was standing near the truck. "Drive!" I screamed at him. "Get the truck started, now!" He stared at us for a moment. We must have looked insane, bleeding, torn up, absolutely wild with terror. And then he responded to the pure animal panic in my voice. He ran to the truck. The thing came out of the forest maybe 30 seconds later. I only got a clear look at it for a moment, maybe 2 seconds total, because it moved fast and I was focused on getting Sarah into the truck, but what I saw in those 2 seconds has never left me. It was large, maybe 4.5 feet at the shoulder. It had the general shape of a canine, a dog, or a wolf. But there was something fundamentally wrong about the proportions. The legs were too long. The body was too lean, almost skeletal beneath matted fur and raw, exposed skin. And the head was the nightmare part. It was too big, and when it opened its mouth, which it did, I think it was trying to bite or grab Sarah before she got in the truck. I could see all those teeth, rows of them, too many. And underneath the fur on its face, I could see something like human skin. Pale, almost waxy skin, visible in patches where the fur had fallen away or never grown. Marcus gunned the engine. The truck moved. I had one leg in the vehicle and one leg out, and I was holding the door frame, my other hand hauling Sarah fully inside. She was screaming, a high, continuous scream that I could hear even over the engine. The thing lunged at the truck just as Marcus accelerated. It didn't catch us, but it came close. I felt the impact of it hitting the rear bumper. For a moment I felt like it was going to come through the door, that those rows of teeth were going to find Sarah or me or one of us. But the truck picked up speed, and whatever this thing was, however intelligent, however fast, it couldn't keep pace with an accelerating vehicle on a paved road. We made it to the ranger station in silence. Nobody spoke. Sarah kept making this sound like she couldn't quite breathe. Marcus kept the accelerator down until we pulled into the parking lot. Once we were there, physically inside a building with walls and lights and other people, the reality of what we'd seen seemed to hit all of us at once. Sarah started shaking so badly she could barely walk. Marcus wanted to call the police immediately. I had to stop him. "What are we going to tell them?" I said. "That something attacked us in the forest? That it was too fast, too strange to be a known animal? They'll take it seriously for about 20 minutes and then dismiss it as a bear encounter that got exaggerated by panic." "We have evidence," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. "The camp, the personal items, But even as she said it, I knew it wasn't enough. They'd collect it all and investigate, and they'd find the trophies, yes, but they'd come up with a theory about a person, a serial killer living rough in the mountains, and they'd eventually be proven wrong, and then the investigation would go nowhere. And then whoever reported it would be tainted with the stigma of making reports that went nowhere." What I didn't say out loud was what I'd realized in that moment. This thing was too clever to be caught that way. It had allowed us to find its camp. It had let me set up camera traps and gather evidence. And it had demonstrated that it could track me, could stalk me, could come after me and my colleagues when I brought them into its territory. I'd been the one doing the hunting, but I'd been wrong about who was doing the tracking. It's been 3 months since that encounter. I'm not a ranger anymore. I put in my resignation the day after we ran from the forest. Dave didn't ask many questions, just said he was sorry to see me go and that I should try to get some rest. Maybe talk to someone about what happened. Sarah left her position too. She moved out of the state. I got one email from her, from a Chicago address, and all it said was, "I can't unsee what I saw. I can't explain what I experienced. Some things don't fit into the frameworks we have for understanding the world, and I don't think I'm equipped to deal with that. I'm sorry." Marcus finished his graduate work somewhere else. I don't know where. I haven't reached out to any of them. The police did eventually search the area. They found the camp, yes. They found the trophy collection. And they spent 6 weeks trying to construct a theory that would explain the personal items. A traveling serial killer, possibly someone with nomadic tendencies, who had roamed the Appalachians. They never found anyone. They eventually archived the case as ongoing investigation and moved on. The thing is still out there. I know because I still get those feelings, that sense of being watched, being aware of. I sometimes catch that smell on the wind in unexpected places, and I've seen things in the months since I left that have convinced me that my encounter wasn't unique, that they're still hunting, and they're still collecting, and they're still moving through the deep places of the Appalachian Mountains. I think about Mountain Sentry sometimes, the ranger who posted that original account on the forums. I wonder if he's still alive, or if he became part of the collection eventually. I wonder how many rangers, how many hikers, how many people who go into those mountains are never heard from again because of what lives there. There are people who have theories about what these things are. Online in the deep forums and the Reddit communities, people debate endlessly about skinwalkers and dogmen and interdimensional creatures and remnant populations of unknown hominins. They cite each other's stories and build on each other's experiences, and they come up with frameworks that they hope will help them understand. But I don't think we're meant to understand it. I think these things exist in a space between our categories, in the margins of our knowledge, in the deep woods where sunlight doesn't reach and the land was never fully conquered by human civilization. And I think they're doing just fine without our understanding. I still have nightmares. I still smell things that aren't there. I still feel like I'm being watched, even when I'm in my apartment in the city, surrounded by people and lights and noise. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind picks up and the sounds of the city fade away just enough, I swear I can hear it. That wet, clicking laugh, the sound of something that found me once and knows exactly where to find me again. The thing about the mountains is that they're always there, always available, always waiting, and I'll never go back. The first time I saw it, I was already bleeding. I didn't know I was bleeding at first. That's the thing about shock. Your body shuts down certain sensations, prioritizes survival instincts over pain. I was running through Crest Ridge Trail, my boots crushing dead oak leaves, and all I could focus on was the fact that my shirt was torn. The fabric hung in ribbons from my left shoulder, and the cold October air bit at exposed skin. But when I finally stopped, gasping against a massive chestnut oak, I looked down and saw the dark streaks running down my arm. My name is Tajudan. I've been a ranger at Shenandoah Valley State Park for 8 years. I have a master's degree in forestry management. I've hiked every major trail in the Appalachian system, guided lost person search and rescue operations, and spent more nights alone in these mountains than most people spend nights in their own beds. I'm not the type of person who gets scared easily, but standing there on that trail watching my own blood drip onto the forest floor, I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear, not yet, something closer to recognition. The understanding that I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. It had started 3 weeks earlier. I'd been assigned to the northern sector, conducting routine maintenance on the backcountry trails. It was late September, that perfect time in the mountains when the summer tourists thin out and the wilderness feels alive in a way it doesn't during other seasons. The trees were just beginning their color change, and the air carried that crystalline quality that makes you think you can see forever. I was alone, that's standard for my job. Most rangers work solo unless there's a specific incident or a large group project. That day I was flagging damaged sections of the Devil's Backbone Trail, a popular 4.2-mile loop that sees moderate traffic on weekends. The damage was typical: erosion from heavy foot traffic, roots exposed from centuries of footsteps, a few deadfalls that needed clearing. That's when I heard the sound. It wasn't loud. That was the thing that struck me immediately. In the forest, especially when you're alone and deeply focused on work, you become attuned to the normal acoustic landscape. Birdsong, wind through canopy, the distant murmur of creek water. These form a baseline against which everything else is measured. An abnormal sound cuts through immediately. This was a whimper, not an animal sound exactly. Animals don't whimper like that. It was too almost human, too deliberate, too aware. I stopped my work and straightened up, flag bundle forgotten at my feet. "Hello?" I called out. The forest went silent. Complete, absolute silence. No birds, no wind. It was as if every living thing in a 100-meter radius had stopped moving simultaneously. I learned later that this was important, that this silence was a warning. "If you're injured, I'm a park ranger," I called out again, louder this time. Professional, reassuring. "Let me know where you are." Nothing. I waited for maybe 2 minutes, listening hard. The silence continued. I'm not ashamed to admit that I felt the first real twinge of uneasiness then. Not fear, uneasiness. Something was off. In 8 years, I'd encountered plenty of lost hikers, injured visitors, even a few people in psychiatric crises, but they responded to voices. People in trouble respond. I grabbed my radio from my belt and switched to the ranger station frequency. Static hissed. "This is Ranger Tajudan, Sector North, Devil's Backbone Maintenance," I reported. "I'm hearing something that might indicate an injured hiker. Running an audio check before proceeding." "Copy that, Tajudan," came the response from Marcus, the station supervisor. His voice was calm, routine. "What's your 1020? I gave him my GPS coordinates. He acknowledged and told me to check it out, to contact him immediately if I needed assistance. This was all standard. We did it 100 times a year. I walked toward the direction the sound had come from, about 30 meters northeast of the trail. The forest there was denser, mixed hardwoods with Virginia creeper vining up the trunks, mountain laurel blocking the understory. I had to move carefully, pushing branches aside. "I'm coming toward you," I called. I'm a ranger, you're safe. As I pushed through a particularly dense stand of laurel, I saw it. It was a deer. No, it was wrong. It looked like a deer at first. It had the general shape, the proportions. But something about how it moved was alien. The way its front legs bent backward slightly, like the joints were articulated differently than they should be. The way its head swiveled toward me. Too far, too complete a rotation. The neck twisting at an angle that would snap a normal cervical spine. The creature watched me for 3 full seconds. I could see its eyes. This is what people never understand when I try to describe it. The eyes were the worst part. They were aware, conscious. There was intelligence behind them, but it was wrong. A human intelligence wearing an animal face like an actor wears a mask. Then it made that sound again, that whimper. But this time I understood it wasn't a sound of distress, it was laughter. The creature bolted. It didn't move like a deer should move. Deer are quick and graceful. This thing was efficient, a direct, terrible efficiency of limb and muscle that was more like a 4-legged runner, a human sprinting on hands and feet. The image burns in my mind. That bent-jointed gait, that almost deer body moving with deliberate, purposeful speed. I didn't follow it. I'm trained in many things, but I'm also trained to recognize when something exceeds the parameters of human understanding. And whatever that was, it exceeded those parameters. I stood there among the laurel, breathing hard, telling myself I'd seen a diseased deer. Something with a spinal condition that affected the joints. It was the only explanation. Anything else was impossible, but impossible things were starting to accumulate. Over the next few days, I noticed signs. Not obvious signs, nothing that would stand up to scientific scrutiny, but patterns emerging in the way a predator patterns emerges when you've learned to read the forest. Scratches on trees in the north sector. Not claw marks, too uniform, too deliberate. They looked like marks made by a knife or sharp bone slashing in straight lines about 7 feet up the trunk. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Marking territory or marking something else. Dead animals left in the middle of trails. A raccoon posed on a rock at the Devil's Backbone Junction, completely intact except for the fact that its skull had been crushed. From above, as if something heavy had stepped on it deliberately. Not a scavenger kill. Too clean, too purposeful. Footprints. This is where it stopped being deniable. I found the first one about a week after the deer incident, on the morning of October 3rd. I was conducting trail maintenance in the eastern sector, about 2 kilometers from any marked path. I was flagging a new route that the park administration wanted to open, a short scenic walk that would appeal to less experienced hikers. I saw it in the soft earth beside Stony Creek where I'd stopped to check water flow levels. It was a handprint. I know this sounds insane. I'm aware of how it sounds. Handprints can have lots of explanations. Rock climbers, off-trail hikers. Locals illegally using parkland, except this print had 4 fingers and a thumb, 5 separate digits, and each digit ended not in a nail but in something sharper, something like a claw. And the hand that made it was enormous. The span from thumb to pinky was nearly 12 inches. The palm itself the size of a dinner plate. I photographed it with my phone. I've looked at that photograph more times than I can count, and each time my stomach knots in the same way. I didn't report it. That's the decision I made that burned everything down later. I didn't report it. I can't explain why, not in a way that makes logical sense. But there was something in me that understood, something older than my training, older than my professional obligations, that told me reporting this would be a mistake, that whatever was leaving these signs, it would respond very badly to an official investigation, to more rangers coming into its territory. That's when I started to understand what I was dealing with. The Appalachian Mountains are old. Not old in the way that mountains anywhere are old, but old in a different way. This land has been inhabited by humans for thousands of years. The Cherokee walked these valleys. The Shawnee hunted these ridges. Then came colonists, then settlers, then loggers and coal miners. Generations upon generations of people living close to the land, learning its secrets, and every culture that has lived here has told the same stories. The skin stealers, the shape changers, the things that wear human faces and walk on 2 legs, but underneath the borrowed flesh there's something else. Something that watches from the tree line, something that hunts. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every ranger does. They're folklore, the kind of thing locals tell around fires to spook newcomers. I'd always dismissed them as cultural mythology, the human tendency to personify natural threats. But standing there in the forest with a photograph of an impossible handprint on my phone, I wasn't so sure. I did something stupid then. Looking back, I can see how stupid it was, but in the moment it felt like the only logical course of action. I went to old Raymond. Raymond lives about 3 kilometers from the park boundary, in a cabin he's maintained for 63 years. He's not really supposed to be there. The land was incorporated into the state park system back in 1987, but through a series of grandfather clause provisions, he was allowed to stay. He's in his 80s now, a Shawnee elder with a memory that spans the entire modern history of these mountains. I found him on his porch, sitting in a rocking chair, smoking a clay pipe. "Ranger Tajadun," he said without looking at me. "You've seen something." I didn't bother with niceties. I pulled up the photograph on my phone. He looked at it for a long time. His expression didn't change, but his hands stopped rocking. "Where?" he asked. "Stony Creek, eastern sector." He nodded slowly. "There are always more in October, when the veil thins." "This is real then," I said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not imagining this." "Oh, you're not imagining it," Raymond said. He set down his pipe and looked at me for the first time. His eyes were ancient. "The question isn't whether it's real, Ranger. The question is what you're going to do about it." He told me the history then, in that measured way of old people who have held secrets for decades. "The Appalachian valleys were never uninhabited," he said, "not even before humans came. There were things here already. The elders knew about them. Some of them could change their shape, move between forms. Some of them were malevolent, predatory. Some of them could wear human skin if they killed a human first, though there was always something wrong about the wearing of it. A wrongness that only other humans could perceive, a distortion in the way the borrowed flesh moved. The Cherokee had methods for dealing with them. So did the Shawnee. You didn't fight them directly. They were too fast, too strong, too aware. Instead, you recognized them, avoided them, and if necessary, you found ways to drive them out of territory. But as more and more humans came to the mountains, as the forest was cut and developed, those creatures had fewer places to go. Many of them retreated deeper into the wilderness, but some adapted. They learned to live alongside humans, to hunt cattle and deer, to use the night to move unseen, and occasionally they hunted humans. "There was one in this range about 40 years ago," Raymond said. "It took hikers, 3 in one season. The authorities never figured out what happened. They blamed it on accidents, exposure, getting lost. But the hunters knew. The ones who spent time in these mountains. They knew what was doing the killing." "What happened to it?" I asked. "It moved on, or it was killed, or it died of natural causes. The stories get confused after a while." He paused. "What I'm telling you is, don't go looking for it, and don't let anyone else come looking for it either." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because," Raymond said, "you work in its territory now, and because you seem like the kind of person who needs to understand what they're dealing with before they can accept it and live with it." I left his cabin with more questions than answers, but something had shifted in my mind. I was no longer living in a state of denial. I was living in a state of terrible, clear understanding. For the next 2 weeks I maintained the trails as usual, but I changed my patterns. I never worked alone. When I was in the northern sector, I requested backup from other rangers. When I was in the eastern sector, I worked in groups. I stayed on marked trails only. I avoided the forest during twilight hours, when things move more freely. I told myself this was precaution, professional caution. It was rational and sensible, but inside I was terrified. And then on the morning of October 24th, a group of hikers called the ranger station reporting a lost person. A 34-year-old woman named Jennifer Mercer had gone on a solo day hike the previous afternoon and never returned. She had been hiking the Devil's Backbone Trail. The search launched immediately. Rescue coordinators, local police, volunteer search teams. The park was locked down. All non-essential personnel evacuated. I was assigned to the search, standard protocol for active ranger staff. That's when everything got worse. They found her at dawn on the second day of the search, about 2 kilometers off trail in a ravine. Most of her was found. Not all of her, but most. The official report said she'd suffered a severe fall. The medical examiner concluded multiple traumatic injuries consistent with a multi-meter plunge into rocky terrain. She could have been unconscious when she fell, or disoriented. Hypothermia and hypovolemic shock would have come relatively quickly. The bruising patterns, though, the way the flesh on her left side had been stripped away, the official description called it post-mortem animal predation, but I'd seen the photographs. Those weren't random scavenger marks. Those were deliberate, systematic. They were a message. I knew what it was saying. It was saying, "This is my territory. This is what happens to people in my territory." And I knew, with absolute certainty, that Jennifer Mercer's accident had been no accident at all. That was 2 weeks ago. That was before I finally saw it, really saw it. For the first time, they promoted me to sector supervisor 3 days after Jennifer Mercer's body was recovered. It was meant as recognition of my competence and dedication. The old supervisor, Michael Cho, had taken early retirement in the wake of the accident. The administration wanted to move quickly to restore stability. I was the obvious choice. Experienced, certified, good with the other rangers. I should have refused. I didn't refuse. In retrospect, I can see how arrogant that decision was. How blind. I thought that if I just maintained my routines, if I stayed professional and focused, then the normal world would continue to operate around me. That whatever occupied these mountains would recognize me as a ranger, as a designated keeper of this space, and would leave me alone. This is what we tell ourselves when confronted with things we don't understand. We try to find a logic to them. We try to create a framework of understanding that allows us to continue functioning. The forest doesn't care about your logic. In my new role, I started accessing the detailed incident reports, the search and rescue logs, environmental assessments, all the documentation that existed in the park system. What I found was a pattern. Going back 15 years, there were 7 confirmed missing persons within park boundaries. 7 people who went for hikes and were never found, or were found days or weeks later in locations that made no sense. Experienced hikers found many kilometers away from marked trails, with no clear explanation for how they'd gotten there. People found with severe injuries that couldn't be explained by simple falls. 3 of them had been categorized as animal attacks, though the specifics were vague. 2 had been ruled accidental deaths with contributing factors of exposure or disorientation. 1 had simply never been found. 1, Jennifer Mercer, had been confirmed as a fatal fall. No predator had ever been officially identified. No studies had been commissioned to investigate. The cases had simply been filed, explained away, and largely forgotten by the public consciousness. But there was a geographic pattern. All 7 incidents had occurred in the northern and eastern sectors. All 7 had involved people hiking in the late afternoon or early evening hours, or people who were camping overnight. All 7 had involved some element of the victim being alone, or becoming separated from their group. It was a hunting pattern. This thing, whatever it was, didn't hunt randomly. It hunted selectively. It chose vulnerable targets, and it eliminated them efficiently. The knowledge of this sat in my stomach like a stone, heavy, immovable. I started keeping detailed notes, not official reports, personal notes in a private journal. I documented every unusual sign I found in the forest. More handprints, now, with new locations added to the map. Scratches on trees, animal carcasses arranged in patterns that couldn't be natural. Once a human article of clothing draped over a branch near Stony Creek. A hiking sock, weathered and old, that I couldn't identify. I became obsessed. I would spend my days working my ranger duties and my nights researching folklore. I read everything I could find about skinwalkers, shapeshifters, and Appalachian cryptids. There was surprisingly much material available: academic papers on folklore, websites dedicated to cryptozoology, books written by people far more credulous than I am but who had compiled centuries of anecdotal evidence. The descriptions varied by culture and region, but certain elements repeated: a creature that could move between forms, that looked almost human but with subtle wrongness in the proportions, that had intelligence, cunning, even a sense of humor about its predation, that hunted in packs or alone depending on some logic we didn't understand, that marked territory, that seemed to play with prey before killing it. The folklore suggested that these creatures were territorial, that they could be driven away by certain practices, that they were vulnerable at certain times. But the folklore also made clear that once one had decided to hunt in a particular area, it was nearly impossible to remove it. On November 8th, I was working in the northern sector doing stream maintenance. The weather had turned cold, and the first real snow was expected within days. The tourist season was winding down dramatically. By late November, most casual visitors would abandon the park to hikers and winter sports enthusiasts. The forest was quiet. I was alone. I'd stopped requesting backup. It seemed pointless. If the thing wanted me, it would get me regardless of whether I had witnesses. And keeping other rangers in the vicinity just meant it would have more options for hunting. I was using a flat shovel to clear debris from Crest Ridge Stream, deepening the water channel, when I heard the sound. Not the whimpering sound from before. This was different. This was a call, a sound somewhere between a bird cry and a human shout, but stretched and modulated in a way no human or bird could produce. It lasted for about 3 seconds, and when it cut off, the silence that followed seemed to have more weight than the sound had. I stood up slowly. The stream ran in a ravine about 10 meters deep, bordered on both sides by steep banks and rocky forest floor. I was on the eastern bank. The call had come from the western bank, probably 30 or 40 meters away. "Who's there?" I called out. The forest didn't answer. I gathered my tools and began climbing out of the ravine. This was standard practice. If someone was in need of assistance, I needed to access them. If they were engaging in illegal activity on parkland, I needed to move toward them and document it. The rational explanations fell away quickly once I climbed out and got my first good look. There was a figure standing about 40 meters away, on a ridge overlooking the ravine. At first I thought it was a person. It was bipedal, upright, roughly human in proportions. It was wearing what looked like outdoor clothing, dark colors, hiking-appropriate gear. For a moment my mind tried to assign it entirely to the human category. A lost hiker, someone needing help. Then it turned its head to look directly at me, and I saw the face. It was wrong. This is inadequate language. It was wrong in the way that a statue of a human is wrong, proportionally almost correct but fundamentally off. The face was too long, the eyes too far apart and too large. The mouth moved in a way that suggested the jaw was constructed differently than a human jaw, with hinges and articulation points in unfamiliar locations. And underneath all of that, there was something else looking out, something that had been watching me for weeks, something that was standing 10 meters from me and assessing whether I was worth hunting. For a moment, just a moment, I believed I was going to die. I could feel it like a physical thing, the weight of that creature's attention, the calculation happening behind those two large eyes. The way it was analyzing me, categorizing me, deciding whether I represented a threat or an opportunity. Every cell in my body screamed to run. Instead, I did something that, looking back, was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever done. I spoke to it. "I know what you are," I said. My voice was steady. I have no idea how it remained steady. "And I know what you want." The creature's head tilted. The movement was too complete, the head rotating further than should be possible on a human neck. The hiking clothes it was wearing became suddenly apparent as just clothes, draped over a form that wasn't quite right for them, like a child's drawing of a person rendered in 3 dimensions. "I'm not here to stop you," I continued. "I'm just asking you to stay in the deep forest, the areas tourists don't go. Avoid the marked trails." I don't know why I said those things. They came from some part of me that was still trying to negotiate with a world that had become fundamentally irrational, that was trying to establish a covenant with something that probably didn't recognize concepts like human bargains. The creature made a sound. It was low, almost subsonic, and it resonated in my chest cavity. It might have been laughter, it might have been something else entirely. Then it turned and walked away. Not ran. Walked. At a normal, leisurely pace, moving deeper into the forest, disappearing between the trees with a kind of casual grace that made my breath catch in my throat. I stood there for what might have been 10 minutes, breathing hard, unable to move. The forest around me was completely silent, not the normal silence of the wilderness, but that eerie, unnatural quiet where every living thing has gone still. When I finally moved, I walked back toward the park headquarters. I didn't complete my work on the stream. I didn't collect my tools properly. I just walked out of the forest and drove my truck to the ranger station. Marcus, the supervisor on duty, took one look at me and asked if I was okay. "I need to speak with you about the park's predator control protocols," I said. We talked for an hour. I didn't tell him what I'd actually seen. Instead, I focused on the patterns I'd found in the incident reports. The concentration of incidents in specific areas, the seasonal variation, the timing of attacks relative to visitor patterns. "I think we need to issue warnings," I said, "about solo hiking in remote areas, about avoiding evening hikes, about sticking to marked trails." Marcus listened, nodded, took notes. At the end he said, "We can draft some advisories, but Tajadan, there's no confirmed predator in the park. We'd look foolish issuing warnings about something we can't prove exists." "What if another person dies?" I asked. "Then we adjust our protocols," he said. "But right now, without evidence, we don't have cause." I left his office understanding that the administration wouldn't help me. They couldn't. How would I explain the situation to them? The ranger saw something weird in the woods and wants to issue warnings based on folklore and a pattern in old incident reports. They'd transfer me to a different park or suggest I take medical leave. I was on my own. That night, I drove to Raymond's cabin. I found him on his porch again, despite the cold. The season was turning toward winter. It revealed itself to you, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And it let you leave. Yes. Then it's made a choice about you, he said. It's decided what role you'll play in this territory. And what role is that? I asked. A witness, he said. Someone who knows the truth but can't prove it. Someone who understands what's happening but has to keep functioning in a world of people who don't believe it. That's a particular kind of torture, Ranger. I'm sorry you've been chosen for it. How do I stop it? I asked. You don't, he said. You learn to live beside it. You try to protect people without revealing what needs protection from. You maintain the boundaries and hope that the creature maintains them too. That's not an acceptable answer. It's the only answer, he said. I left his cabin and drove home. My apartment is in the town of Shenandoah, about 15 kilometers from the park. It's a small place, a converted farmhouse with 2 bedrooms and a view of the valley. I've lived there for 6 years. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a plan. I was going to find a way to drive the creature out of the park. I didn't know how, not yet, but I was going to figure it out. There had to be something, some weakness, some vulnerability, some method that the folklore hadn't documented. I was going to save this park from predation, and I was going to do it alone. It was the most foolish decision I'd ever made. November came with hard weather. The first serious snow of the season fell on November 15th, 12 inches that caught the morning meteorologists by surprise and persisted through the afternoon. The park was beautiful and deadly. Ice forming on trail edges, stream water dropping to dangerous temperatures, the kind of conditions where a single wrong step could be fatal. I used the weather as cover for my investigation. The way I saw it, the creature would need shelter during the worst weather. It would be driven to more predictable patterns, more concentrated hunting. If I could find its den, I could figure out what it was vulnerable to. I spent my workdays conducting what appeared to be normal ranger patrols, but each trip was actually a reconnaissance mission. I was mapping territories, looking for unusual concentrations of signs, places where the vegetation was damaged in ways that suggested regular passage of something large. The northern sector, specifically around Devil's Backbone Trail, seemed to be a hub of activity. I found dead animals there repeatedly, too many to be natural predation. I found more handprints, now with clear claw marks that I photographed meticulously. I found scat that I collected in specimen bags, knowing I couldn't have it analyzed without raising questions. By late November, I'd narrowed my search to a specific area, a high valley about 3 kilometers north of the nearest marked trail, accessible only through difficult off-trail terrain. The valley had a natural spring, a cave system, and dense forest coverage. If I were a predatory creature choosing a base camp, this is where I would have chosen. On November 27th, Thanksgiving Day, I went to that valley. I told the station that I was doing a solo evaluation of a potential new trail location. I packed supplies for an overnight stay, water, energy bars, a first aid kit, my radio, and a flashlight. I deliberately didn't bring a weapon. I wasn't trying to kill the creature. I was trying to understand it. The hike-in took me most of the morning. The snow had mostly melted by then, but the ground was wet and treacherous. I had to navigate by topographic map and compass, reading the landscape to find the route of least resistance. By early afternoon, I was in the valley. It was immediately obvious that this place was different. The vegetation had a stunted quality, as if something was preventing normal growth. The trees were sparse for such a rich forest environment. There were bones scattered throughout the clearing, deer mostly, but other animals too, and among the bones were items of human origin: a hiking boot, a torn backpack, weathered by seasons of exposure, what looked like part of a tent. The items of dead hikers. I felt my stomach clench, but I forced myself to remain calm and methodical. I documented everything with photographs. I gathered some items, the boot, a remnant of clothing, and bagged them carefully. Evidence. Though of what, and for whom, I still wasn't certain. The cave entrance was at the far end of the valley, formed from the natural erosion of limestone. It was large enough to require a light source to see into, but my flashlight revealed only a corridor extending deeper into the earth. I didn't go in. Some instinct, the same instinct that had allowed me to speak to the creature instead of running, told me that entering the cave would be a mistake. That would be crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Instead, I set up a camp in the clearing, well away from the cave entrance. I built a small fire, not large enough to be threatening, but visible. a signal that I was present and acknowledging the space. As night fell, I waited. The cold came first. Appalachian nights in late November cut through you, especially at higher elevations. I huddled near my fire, drinking hot water with electrolyte powder, trying to keep my core temperature stable. The sounds came around midnight. At first, they were distant, animal sounds, the normal nocturnal language of the forest. But they moved closer, they multiplied. There were rustlings in the brush surrounding the clearing, and beneath the rustlings, sounds that weren't quite voices but had the quality of deliberate communication. I turned off my flashlight and sat in the darkness, watching the fire. It came out of the forest slowly, not hiding. The creature I'd seen on the ridge at Crest Ridge Stream, now in full darkness, now clearly visible in the light of my fire. It was the size of a large man, maybe 2 meters tall, broad-shouldered. It was wearing the hiking clothes it had worn before, and beneath the clothes I could see the shape of something that was definitely not human. The posture was wrong, the way it held its arms was wrong. Even the way its breath moved through its body was wrong, too irregular, as if the lungs were positioned differently than they should be. It sat down across from me, keeping the fire between us. For what must have been 2 hours, we sat in silence. I'm not entirely sure why it didn't kill me. Looking back, I think the creature was curious about me in a way that momentarily overrode its predatory nature. Or perhaps it was conducting a different kind of assessment, a judgment about what I represented and what I could become. "Why are you here?" it asked. The voice was human, almost human. It used English words, but the inflection was slightly off, the vowels not quite formed correctly. It sounded like someone speaking a language they'd learned from recordings but had never fully integrated into their neurology. "I want to understand what you are," I said. "Why?" it asked. The question seemed genuine, not rhetorical. It was actually curious about my motivation. "Because there's a way to make peace," I said, "between you and the people who hike these trails." The creature made a sound, that subsonic laugh again. "There is no peace. There is only territory and hunger. This is my place now. You are the visitors here." "Jennifer Mercer was a visitor," I said. "And you killed her." The creature looked at the fire. For a moment it seemed almost contemplative. "She hunted deer. I hunted her. It is the same thing. Why does her death bother you more than the deaths of the deer?" I didn't have a good answer to that. "Because she was human," I said finally. "Because I'm human. Because she had a family that's grieving." "The deer have family too," the creature said. "They grieve. Their systems know the loss just as human systems know the loss, but you don't weep for them." This was not the conversation I'd expected to have. "I want to make a deal with you," I said. I didn't know what the deal would be yet, but I was buying time, trying to think. A real negotiation between us, boundaries that both of us respect. The creature stood up. It was a smooth, graceful motion, far more graceful than a creature of that size should have been able to manage. "You want to bargain with me as though I'm like you? As though I'm a person with whom one conducts business?" It tilted its head, and in the firelight I could see something like amusement in its 2 large eyes. "I'm going to tell you something, Ranger Tajadan. I'm going to tell you what I really am." "What?" I asked. "I'm not a creature that came from somewhere else. I'm not an animal that mutated. I'm not a spirit or a god or a force of nature. I'm something far more specific." It paused. "I'm a person, Ranger. Just not your kind of person." Then it walked back into the forest, and the sounds around the clearing faded away. I didn't sleep that night. I left the valley at dawn without looking back. The hike out took 3 hours, and by the time I reached the marked trail at the valley's southern border, I was shaking with exhaustion and something else, something that felt like the beginning of understanding. I drove back to my apartment and called in sick for the next 2 days. I told Marcus that I'd come down with a stomach bug during my solo hike, that I needed rest to recover. He accepted this without question. What I actually did was sit at my kitchen table and try to articulate what I'd learned. The creature had said it was a person, not an animal. And the more I thought about that statement, the more sense it made. Not in any conventional sense, but in a way that reorganized how I understood the folklore and the patterns. These creatures weren't demons or monsters. They weren't supernatural entities from another dimension. They were something far stranger. They were another sapient species that had been living in North America long before humans arrived. They had intelligence, language, culture. They had territory and hunting patterns. They had made a deliberate choice to live in concert with human society, sometimes hunting, sometimes avoiding, always maintaining a separation that prevented direct conflict. Until recently, the change in pattern, the increased predation, wasn't because a new creature had moved into the mountains. It was because something in the dynamic had shifted. The human footprint in the wilderness was increasing. The park received more visitors each year. The marked trails were expanding. The noise and disruption was growing. The creature I was dealing with was defending its territory against an invasion, and it had decided to use hunting as a language of resistance. This understanding changed everything. I spent November 28th through 30th reviewing everything I knew with this new lens. The pattern of incidents made more sense now. Jennifer Mercer hadn't died because she was unlucky or because she'd made a mistake. She'd died because she'd been in the wrong place, during the wrong time, in the creature's statement-making campaign. The creature was saying, "This land is mine, you are not welcome here." And the tragedy was that the park administration couldn't hear that message. They could only see the pattern as random accidents, unfortunate casualties of a dangerous wilderness. I had to find a way to mediate. That's the thought that came to me on the morning of December 1st. I had a responsibility as a ranger. A responsibility that went beyond protecting human visitors. I had a responsibility to protect the balance that existed in this land, to recognize that the mountains belong to more than just people, and to find a way to negotiate coexistence between the human and non-human inhabitants. I drafted a proposal. It wasn't official. I couldn't make it official without revealing information I had no way of proving. But I wrote out a detailed recommendation for the park administration proposing new restrictions on backcountry access. Specific trails would be closed to solo hikers. Overnight camping would be limited to designated areas. Certain high-value wilderness regions would be off-limits to all visitors except during specific seasons when the creature was less active. The ostensible reasoning was environmental conservation, protection of sensitive ecosystems and wildlife habitat. The real reasoning was to establish a buffer zone, a human-free space where the creature could hunt and exist without the constant pressure of human incursion. I presented the proposal to Marcus on December 2nd. He read through it carefully. "This is significant," he said. "These restrictions would reduce park usage dramatically, especially the backcountry camping limitations. A lot of visitors come for the remote experience." "It's necessary," I said. "Environmental surveys indicate habitat degradation in those regions. We need to implement protections before we lose species diversity." He looked at me carefully. "You've never pushed for restrictions like this before. What changed?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm looking at the long-term health of the park. These are short-term sacrifices for long-term sustainability." It took 2 weeks, but the proposal made its way up the administrative chain. There was resistance. Park directors don't like restrictions that reduce revenue from visitor fees. But the environmental angle was persuasive. By mid-December, a modified version of my proposal had been approved. Certain trails were closed to overnight camping. The northern sector would have restricted access October through March. Solo backcountry hiking would be prohibited in identified wilderness zones. The restrictions weren't everything I'd proposed, but they were something. I waited to see if it would be enough. December passed without incident. No missing persons, no bodies found. The forest was quiet. Raymond visited my apartment on December 23rd. I hadn't invited him, but he appeared at my door in the late afternoon wearing a heavy coat. "You've made your choice," he said, not as a greeting but as a statement of fact. "I've tried to establish boundaries," I said. "Negotiated boundaries. And if they don't hold?" I didn't answer. "There's going to be a cost," he said. "Something like this always has a cost. You're carrying it now, whether you acknowledge it or not. The knowledge, the responsibility, the truth that the world is stranger and darker than most people understand. That's the payment you've made for your bargain." "I can live with that," I said. "Can you?" he asked. "For how long? Years? Decades? Are you going to spend your entire career managing a secret that no one else can know about? Are you going to stay in these mountains forever? Or are you going to move on and leave someone else to figure out what you've learned?" I hadn't allowed myself to think about these questions. "I don't know," I said. "Neither do I," he said. "But I know this. The mountains have chosen you. And they won't release you until you've done whatever it is they need you to do." He left, and I was alone again with my knowledge and my responsibility. It's been 2 months since the restrictions took effect. No one has died. No one has gone missing. The forest, from all outward appearances, has returned to normal. But I know better. I still work in the park. I still conduct ranger patrols and maintain trails and respond to visitor questions. I still pretend that everything is routine and that I'm just a normal ranger doing a normal job. Except I'm not. On my days off, I hike into the northern sector, to places where the restrictions prevent visitors from going. I'm mapping the creature's territory. I'm understanding its patterns. I'm learning to read the signs it leaves, to understand what it's telling me. It has never threatened me since that night in the valley. But I can feel its presence. It's always there, just out of sight, watching me as I watch it. We've reached an understanding, the creature and I. The details of that understanding aren't something I can explain to anyone else. It's not a friendship or a partnership. It's something stranger, a mutual recognition of existence, a negotiation between two intelligent species that occupy the same space but live by fundamentally different rules. What I'm doing, what I'll continue to do, is maintain the boundaries. I'll keep the human world away from the creature's hunting grounds, and in exchange the creature will limit its predation to areas where human incursion is minimal. But there's a darkness to this knowledge that grows in me every day, because I understand now that the creature isn't unique. There are more like it, scattered throughout the American wilderness. In the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, the thick forests of the Pacific Northwest, the bayous of Louisiana, each one territorial, each one intelligent, each one potentially capable of defending its space through violence if necessary. We're living on a land that isn't as empty as we thought. We're sharing space with something older and stranger than we ever acknowledged. And every day that something is being pushed further into corners, compressed into smaller and smaller spaces, forced to defend itself against an ever-expanding human presence. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if the boundaries I've established will hold. I don't know if other rangers will eventually discover what I've discovered, or if the creature will make mistakes and allow evidence of its existence to surface. What I know is this: I was hiking in the mountains 8 months ago as a normal person in a normal world. I saw something that changed my understanding of reality. I've spent every day since trying to reconcile the existence of the creature with the existence of human civilization in these same mountains. And every day it gets harder, because now I see the mountain differently. I see it as a contested space, a place where two species are engaged in a slow, quiet negotiation, where human rules and human law are constantly testing themselves against something that predates human civilization and will probably outlast it. The Appalachian Mountains have always been wild. Now I understand exactly how wild they are, and I know, with complete certainty, that I'll never leave them. Whatever the creature is, whatever it has decided I am to it, it has bound me to these mountains as surely as if it had marked me with its claws. I am a witness, a guardian of secrets, a bridge between two worlds that can never fully know each other. Some days I'm not sure if this is a gift or a curse, but I know absolutely that it's permanent. The forest has claimed me, and I'm beginning to understand that the forest has no intention of ever letting me go. The first sign wasn't the bones, it was the silence. I've worked the Alpacha Ridge system for 13 years, and if you spend enough time in those mountains, you learn to listen. The old ponderosa pines whisper in the updrafts. The creek below Raven's Peak carries its own language. Even the rocks, especially the rocks, they speak if you're quiet enough. But that morning in late September, the entire western ridge was mute, dead, like something had reached down and muffled the world under wet cloth. My name is Dakota. That's what my crew calls me, anyway. I don't talk about my actual name much. Some names carry weight that strangers don't understand. My grandfather said certain names were doors and some doors should stay closed. I was on hour 3 of my pre-dawn patrol when I found the first marker disturbed. The system works like this. Every 2 miles along the perimeter trails we place cairns, rock stacks, simple visual markers to track if hikers drift beyond the designated zones. They're innocuous enough that tourists don't question them. What they don't know is that the cairns serve a secondary purpose. They tell us when something's wrong, when something doesn't belong. The cairn at marker 47, near the Dead Woman's Creek crossing, had been deconstructed, not toppled, not scattered by rockslide or flash flood. Deconstructed. The stones were arranged in a deliberate pattern. They spelled something, or they were meant to. I couldn't make sense of the configuration, but my hands were shaking as I photographed it with my ranger phone. I should have turned back then. I should have radioed it in and waited for the regional coordinator to send a team. But the thing about spending 13 years in a place is that you start to feel like it's yours. like you understand it, like you can reason with it. That was my first mistake. I followed the trail back from the cairn, looking for prints, boot treads, animal tracks, anything to explain how someone had reached that location without triggering the motion sensors we'd installed along the main approach paths. The ground was dry, rocky, no clear footprints, but there was something else, a smell. Not rot, exactly, not animal musk. It was like copper and ozone and something beneath that, something that made my sinuses burn and my throat tighten. The wind picked up, channeling down from the higher elevations, and the smell vanished. When I looked up, I realized I'd walked nearly half a mile from my marked route. The trail behind me was gone. The cairns marking my path back were invisible. They should have been visible from here, but the angle of the ridge and the morning light and the thickening mist made the landscape feel foreign. Inverted. I checked my GPS. The device was functioning. According to the coordinates, I was exactly where I should be. But my eyes told me something different. That's when I heard it. Not quite a sound, more like the absence of sound given shape and weight. A figure, maybe 100 yards up the trail, standing perfectly still at the tree line. At first I thought it was a hiker. The silhouette was roughly human-shaped, but the proportions were off in a way that made my brain struggle to process. The arms seemed too long, the torso too narrow, the head tilted at an angle that suggested it was watching me, though I couldn't see any face. "Park Ranger," I shouted, my hand instinctively moving to the radio on my belt. "This is Ranger territory. You need to identify yourself and exit immediately." The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my voice at all. It just stood there, perfectly silent, perfectly still. My training said, establish dominance, assert authority, demand response. But my instincts, the part of my brain that my grandfather would have called the old knowing, screamed at me to move, to run, to not look directly at the thing in the tree line. I forced myself to walk toward it instead. Every step was an act of will. The mist was getting thicker. The morning light was dying despite the sun supposedly rising above the eastern rim. I kept my eyes on the figure but couldn't track its details. It was like looking at a photograph that had been deliberately overexposed in its center. The harder I focused, the less I could see. At 30 yards, I raised my radio. "This is Ranger Dakota, Sector 7, Marker 47. I have a potential trespasser on the Ridge Trail. Individual is non-responsive. Approximate location 2847 meters elevation coordinates." I stopped because the figure moved. Not toward me, not away. It moved wrong. The movement didn't flow the way human movement flows. It was like watching film frames skip. The figure was suddenly closer. 30 yards collapsed to 10, without any visible motion between the two positions. The passage of space compressed. I fumbled backward, my boot catching on a root, and I went down hard on my tailbone. The radio jumped out of my hand and skittered down the rocky slope. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs would crack. The figure was gone. The tree line where it had stood was empty. I waited, chest heaving, for maybe 5 full minutes. The mist swirled. The rocks beneath my feet were real and present, but the presence I'd felt, that overwhelming sense of being observed by something that didn't have eyes, lingered like frostbite in my nervous system. I found my radio 3 meters down the slope. The display was cracked, but it still functioned. I didn't try to report what I'd seen. How would I explain it? A shadow? An optical illusion caused by exhaustion and pre-dawn darkness? By the time I finished my sentence, I'd sound unhinged. Instead, I marked the GPS coordinates, 2847 meters, the spot where the figure had been, and I started the walk back to base camp. The return trip took twice as long as it should have. The trail seemed to reorganize itself. Paths that should have led downhill curved back on themselves. Landmarks I was certain I'd passed appeared again from different angles. It was like the mountain was deliberately making itself hard to leave. By the time I reached base camp, my shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the autumn chill. My supervisor, Marcus, took one look at my face and asked what happened. I told him the equipment malfunctioned and I needed to log it for repair. He accepted this without question. We're trained not to push each other about the hard days. That evening, I reviewed the photograph I'd taken of the deconstructed cairn. The image had corrupted somehow. The stones were barely visible, obscured by a strange pixelation that looked almost intentional. I deleted it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my cabin with every light on, reading reports from other ranger stations in the region. The usual autumn activity, hikers needing rescue after underestimating the terrain, trail damage from weather, the occasional wildlife incident, nothing unusual, but I kept thinking about the figure, about how wrong it had moved, about how the space between us had collapsed like gravity had suddenly reversed. The next morning, the intercom in the station crackled. Marcus's voice. "Dakota, we've got a call from the ranger station on the northern approach. They found something at marker 51. You need to see this." Marker 51 was 3 miles from marker 47. My stomach went cold. I didn't ask what they'd found. I just grabbed my pack and headed out. Marker 51 sat at the convergence of 3 trails, at a lower elevation where the rocky terrain gave way to dense forest. Rangers rarely encountered visitors this far off the main paths. The approach was deliberately made difficult to discourage the casual hikers. This was where we contained the wilderness, where we kept the boundary. The site was cordoned off with the standard yellow tape by the time I arrived. 2 rangers from the northern station, Sarah Chen and David Morales, were standing about 20 feet back, looking at something on the ground with expressions that suggested they'd found a body. What they'd found was worse, a hiker. Alive, technically. A man in his 60s wearing gear from at least a decade ago, the kind of equipment that had been out of production for years. His name was Walter Finch, according to the ID in his pack. The pack was the real problem. The fabric was covered in a substance that looked like frost, except it was September in mild autumn weather, and there was no logical reason for ice to form on equipment. The frost covered the zipper, the straps, the bottom seams. Where it had cracked, there was darkness underneath, not moisture, not decay, just absolute, impenetrable black. But the hiker himself was the real disturbance. Walter Finch was responsive. He answered questions. He had a pulse. But something fundamental had broken inside him. His eyes tracked movement, but there was no recognition behind them, no understanding. When we asked him his name, he repeated it back without inflection. When we asked where he'd been, he said, "Walking. I was walking." "Walking where?" Sarah asked gently, the way you might speak to someone with advanced dementia. "In there," he said, pointing past the trees, toward the ridge, toward marker 47. "In the tall place, where the rocks don't have shadows." I felt my skin go cold. Rocks that don't have shadows. My grandfather used to talk about places like that. Places where the geometry of reality had become thin. Places where things that shouldn't exist could exist because the fundamental rules had been bent. "How long have you been hiking?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Walter's head turned toward me, and for a moment I could see something in his eyes. A flicker of awareness. A moment where the broken thing inside him seemed to pause and consider. "I don't know," he said. "I came to the mountains on September 14th. I remember that because it was my wife's birthday and I'd told her I'd be back before dark." "What year?" David asked. 2006, Walter said. "I was going to surprise her with—" He stopped. His eyes went distant again. The moment of recognition was gone, replaced by that terrible blankness. 2006. We were now in 2024. My hands were shaking again. I made an excuse to step away and called Marcus on the radio. "He's going to need immediate medical evaluation," I said. "Possible exposure to something. Environmental toxin or—" I stopped because I couldn't finish that sentence without sounding insane. "Understood," Marcus said. "Ambulance is en route. Your ETA back to base camp." 30 minutes, I lied. I needed to see something, needed to confirm something. As soon as the ambulance arrived and they'd loaded Walter Finch, now unresponsive again, his brief moment of consciousness, seemingly exhausted, I told Sarah the first was going to do a wider perimeter check. She didn't argue. The Northern Rangers were experienced enough to know that something was deeply wrong here, but they also knew better than to ask direct questions about it. I hiked back toward marker 47. This time I went in daylight. This time I brought my grandfather's knife, a piece of obsidian and bone that probably had no practical application against modern threats, but that he'd pressed into my hands when I was 10 years old and said, "The old things respect intention. You carry this, you're saying you understand the difference between your world and the other world." The cairn at marker 47 had been reconstructed, all of it. The stones I'd photographed were back in their original positions. It was like the deconstructed pattern had never existed. But something was different about the cairn now. It seemed taller, more intentional, more deliberate in its architecture, more like something had been designed rather than simply stacked. I photographed it again. This time the image came through clearly, and in the photograph I could see something I'd missed when looking at it in person. The pattern of the stones spelled out a message in a script I didn't immediately recognize. It looked almost like Cherokee syllabary, but the proportions were wrong. The angles were too sharp. I pulled up my translation app and tried to process the symbols. The app's AI returned a response. Return what was taken. Return what was taken. I'd been a ranger in these mountains for 13 years. I'd never taken anything except photographs and memories. I'd followed the protocols. I'd maintained the boundaries. I'd kept the wilderness cordoned and controlled. But something was telling me that wasn't what they meant. That something old, something that predated the park system and the boundary markers and my entire career, considered me and everyone like me as trespassers, as people who'd come into their space and disrupted something fundamental. That's when I saw the second figure. This one was on the ridge above marker 47, maybe 200 meters higher up the slope. It was standing in the full daylight, perfectly visible, and its shape was worse than the thing I'd seen that morning. This one was almost definitely human-shaped, except for the fact that it was standing completely still with its head tilted back, and it was facing directly into the sun. For how long, I couldn't tell, but the posture suggested it had been doing this for hours, or days, or longer. As I watched, it lowered its head. Slowly, like operating on some invisible hydraulic system. Its head came down until it was level with its shoulders, and then it turned toward me. Even at 200 meters, even in full daylight, I couldn't see its face. There was something about the angle of the light and the shadow beneath its chin that made it impossible to focus on, but I could feel it looking at me. I didn't hesitate this time. I turned and ran. The hike back to base camp should have taken 30 minutes. It took me 58 minutes, and I only made it because I knew the terrain well enough to navigate it without thinking. My body moved on pure adrenaline. My mind was locked on one thought. I needed to reach the boundary of the park. I needed to reach civilization. I needed to call my grandfather. Marcus was waiting for me when I arrived. He took one look and said, "You've seen something." Not "you look shaken." Not "are you okay?" He said it as a statement of fact, like this was something he expected. Like this was something that had happened before. "What's going on?" I demanded. "And I want the full truth." Marcus looked around the station. We were alone. He closed and locked the office door. "Sit down," he said. I sat. "You've been working here 13 years without incident," Marcus continued. "That's because you followed the protocols and you didn't ask questions about why those protocols existed. But I think we've reached the point where questions are necessary." He opened a file cabinet and pulled out a folder. Inside were incident reports dating back to 1987. Not public reports, not filed with the Park Service. Internal reports, ranger-to-ranger observations, documented incidents that had been deliberately suppressed, hikers who went missing and reappeared decades later without aging, expedition equipment showing up in the park with no way to have reached that location given the topography and weather conditions, patterns of disturbance at the marker sites that followed no logical pattern, and descriptions, dozens of descriptions of figures seen on the ridge. Tall, thin, wrong in ways that witnesses struggled to articulate. "This mountain range has been problematic since the park was established," Marcus said. "The indigenous populations called this the place where things walk wrong." There was a series of archaeological expeditions in the 1990s that tried to document what they meant. The results were inconclusive, but the pattern that emerged suggested there was something in the high terrain that predated human settlement, something that was here when the first tribes came through. Something that they learned to avoid. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that there's something living in these mountains that's been here for thousands of years, something that people have known to avoid, and the Park Service has been trying to contain it." "Not contain," Marcus corrected. "Coexist. The boundary markers aren't to keep hikers out, though that's a useful side effect. They're to maintain a territorial agreement. We stay below the line. Whatever's up there stays above it. It's worked for 37 years. No serious incidents, no deaths, just occasional hikers who wander too far and have to be recovered." "Walter Finch," I said. 18 years, Marcus confirmed. "He probably wandered past marker 51 without realizing it. Went into the high terrain, got disoriented. By the time we found him, his mind had gone to a place we can't follow." "The stones," I said. "The message. Return what was taken." Marcus's expression changed. For the first time, I saw actual fear in his face. "What stones?" I told him about the deconstructed cairn. The message, the figures I'd seen. "This is bad," he said quietly. "This means they're active. It means something's changed." "What did we take?" I asked. What does it mean, return what was taken? Marcus didn't answer for a long time. He just stared at the wall, his jaw working like he was chewing on thoughts he didn't want to speak aloud. I don't know, he finally said, but I know who might. We need to call the regional coordinator. We need to escalate this. And Dakota, whatever you do, don't go back up there alone. If they're asking for something to be returned, it means we're already in violation, and they're getting impatient. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in the station's back room, surrounded by filed reports about things that shouldn't exist. Reading testimony from rangers who'd seen things in the mountains that their training and rationality couldn't process. One report, from 1994, contained a description that made my blood stop. The entity was described as impossibly tall, standing with its head back, facing directly into the sun for a period of 4 hours without moving. When observed by personnel, it lowered its head with mechanical precision and appeared to be observing the observer with great intensity. The ranger reported an overwhelming sense of being read by whatever was examining him. He spent 3 weeks in psychiatric observation after the incident. That ranger's name was Raymond Dakota, my grandfather's full name. He'd never told me. All those times he'd talked about the boundary between worlds, all those warnings about doors that should stay closed. He'd walked that ridge. He'd seen what I'd seen, and whatever it was, it had been waiting there for almost 30 years, watching that place where things don't cast shadows, to see if his grandson would return. The regional coordinator arrived 2 days later. His name was David Chen, and he carried himself with the kind of authority that suggested he knew exactly what was happening in these mountains. He spent 6 hours with Marcus and me reviewing all the historical records, and then he made a decision that terrified me more than the figures on the ridge. We're sending a team up to the high markers, he said. We need a physical assessment of all boundary sites. If they're asking for something to be returned, we need to know exactly what that means. This is a bad idea, I said. They're territorial. They're also intelligent, David interrupted. Intelligent entities can be negotiated with. If we understand what's happening, we can establish proper communication protocols. What he was really saying was, we don't know what we're doing, but we're going to pretend we do. The team consisted of myself, David, Marcus, Sarah Chen from the Northern Station, and 2 specialists from the university, a cryptozoologist named Dr. Elena Reyes and an archaeologist named Dr. James Whitmore. They arrived with equipment, digital cameras, infrared sensors, geological surveys, GPS mapping tools, all of it useless for what we were actually facing. We set out at dawn, taking the long route that circled the low terrain and would eventually bring us to the high markers without cutting through the interior. David maintained constant radio contact with base camp. He wanted everything documented. The first 8 kilometers went without incident. The trail was clear, the weather held, the sensors picked up the usual environmental readings. By noon, we'd reached marker 45, then marker 46. Everything seemed normal, which was itself deeply wrong. The silence I'd experienced on my first encounter was absent. The mountain was communicating through the standard channels, bird calls, wind sounds, the creek below, but underneath it all was a vibration. Low frequency. So low that I couldn't hear it exactly, but I could feel it in my bones, in my teeth, in the base of my skull. Dr. Reyes was the first to comment on it. Do you feel that? She asked, checking her infrared readings. There's a subsonic component to the environment. Something's generating it. It's too consistent to be natural geological activity. Probably just wind through the rock formations, David said, but his jaw was tight. We reached marker 47 at 1:30 p.m. The cairn was back in its original configuration. No message, no impossible patterns. Just rocks stacked in the traditional way. Dr. Whitmore began documenting it with the precision of someone cataloging artifacts in a museum. He noted the size of each stone, the arrangement, the weathering patterns, professional, clinical, divorced from the reality that we were trespassing in a place that had already made clear it didn't want us there. That's when Sarah's radio crackled. We've got movement on the eastern perimeter, the voice from base camp said. Multiple thermal signatures approaching from the high terrain. They're converging on your location. David and I exchanged looks. Multiple, plural. We'd been operating under the assumption that there was a single entity, or perhaps a pair. But multiple suggested a population, suggested an organized presence. Get everyone down to marker 46, David ordered. We're pulling back. We moved quickly, abandoning our documentation equipment. Dr. Reyes grabbed her sensors, Dr. Whitmore his camera. We were 50 meters downslope when I saw the first of them. It was moving through the trees with a gait that was almost but not quite human. The proportions were off, the head was too small, the limbs were too long, and it was moving with a fluidity that suggested boneless flexibility, the kind of motion you see in octopi or deep-sea creatures, not terrestrial organisms. There, Sarah pointed. A second shape emerged from the tree line, then a third. They weren't approaching aggressively. They were moving parallel to us, pacing us, like watching a predator evaluate whether prey was worth pursuing. "Keep moving down," David said, and his voice only wavered slightly. "Radio in our position." The subsonic vibration was getting stronger. I could feel it in my sinuses now, in the fluid around my eyes. It was almost like the frequency was trying to vibrate something loose inside my skull. Dr. Reyes was making strange sounds, clicking her tongue, almost rhythmically. When I looked at her, she seemed confused by her own behavior. "I don't know why I'm doing that," she said. "It's like something's making me." The creatures stopped moving parallel. They started closing the distance. "Run," David said. It wasn't a command. It was desperation. We ran. The trail down from marker 47 is steep and technical. You're supposed to move through it carefully, testing each footfall. We didn't. We flew down that mountain like the terrain was our ally and the things behind us were pure nightmare. Which I suppose they were. I could hear them behind us, not the sound of feet on rock, but something like wind moving through a corridor. The sound of displaced air. The sound of weight and mass moving through space in ways that the atmosphere wasn't designed for. Sarah was ahead of me. Dr. Whitmore was behind her. David was right behind me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Dr. Reyes had somehow gotten ahead of all of us. She was making those clicking sounds again, louder now, almost like she was trying to communicate. The subsonic vibration reached a crescendo. For a moment, everything in my perception went white. There was no pain, just a sudden absence of input, like my nervous system had overloaded and shut down. When my vision returned, we'd traveled another 200 meters and the creatures had stopped pursuing. They were standing perfectly still, about 30 meters back, arranged in a line facing us. I counted them. 5. No, 6. There was a seventh barely visible at the edge of the tree line. They weren't trying to get us. They were hurting us. The boundary, David realized. They're pushing us toward the boundary. We staggered down the trail. 50 meters to the boundary marker. 40. 30. The creatures moved at a matching pace, maintaining distance, never getting closer but never allowing us to stop or turn back. At the boundary marker, an old brass plaque indicating the park's protected designation, the creatures stopped. They formed a perfect line along the demarcation point, and then, in a movement that was almost synchronized, they all turned their heads and looked at us. I saw their faces, or what should have been faces. The reality of what was looking at me broke something in my ability to process visual information. I still can't describe it accurately. There were features that suggested eyes and mouths, but the scale was all wrong. The distances between things were too wide or too narrow. Looking at them was like looking at an optical illusion designed specifically to make human perception fail. Looking at them made me understand that evolution, natural selection, adaptation, all of these processes had gone in a direction I couldn't follow. These weren't just unfamiliar, they were wrongness made flesh. My brain tried to reject what I was seeing, and in that moment of rejection something communicated. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't even sound. It was knowledge, downloaded directly into my consciousness. Return. Return what the old one brought away. Return it or we will return ourselves. The knowledge carried with it an image, or something like an image. It was an object, definitely man-made, definitely old, definitely sacred, but the memory was obscured like I was looking at it through smoke. I couldn't see what it was, just that it was real, that it was here, that my grandfather had taken it. "What do they want?" David gasped. "Something my grandfather took," I said. "Something sacred, something that belongs to them." The creatures remained at the boundary line. They didn't cross it, they didn't move. They just stood there perfectly still, with their wrong faces pointed in our direction. "We need to go to your grandfather," David said. "We need to ask him what this is." We limped down the remaining distance to base camp. By the time we reached the station, the sun was setting. David immediately tried to call my grandfather. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Then he picked up. "Dakota," I said. "No formality, just his name." "I've been waiting for you to call," he said. His voice sounded very old. very tired. There's something you need to come get. Something in the mountains. They're saying you took it. There was a long silence on the other end. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It carried a weight that suggested he'd been carrying this for 30 years. Since his encounter. Since the day he walked the ridge and saw what I'd seen. I took it because they were asking for a sacrifice, he said quietly. A young man was missing. A hiker. They had his name carved into stone, and they were asking if anyone would trade. If anyone would give something precious so that he could be returned. I had the item they wanted. An artifact from our family line. Something sacred. I offered it instead of his life. I offered it, and they took the bargain. And he came back. What was it? I asked. Come to my house, he said. I'll show you. But Dakota, be careful. Whatever I did to save a life. But I saved a life by making a debt. And debts in that place, he trailed off. They don't expire, they just accrue interest. My grandfather's house sits outside the park boundaries, on land his family has held for 4 generations. It's a simple place, a cabin built in the 1950s, expanded over the decades, surrounded by trees that are carefully tended but never trimmed back completely. He says the forest was here first, and we just live in it by permission. I arrived an hour after sundown. David Chen came with me. We both needed to understand what my grandfather had taken from the mountain. He was sitting on his porch when we arrived, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild autumn evening. He looked exactly as he always looked. Weathered, patient, like someone who'd made peace with things that couldn't be changed. But his eyes were haunted. Thank you for coming, he said, gesturing for us to sit. What happened? I asked without preamble. In 1994. When you were on the ridge, he told us the story slowly, like he was translating it from a language that didn't quite have equivalents in English. A hiker had gone missing. A young man, 23 years old, had wandered past the boundary markers. Search and rescue had conducted 3 weeks of intensive operations. Nothing. The mountains had taken him. Then, on the 24th day, my grandfather found something at marker 51, the same location where Walter Finch would later appear. It was a stone, not a natural rock. A worked stone, carved with symbols that he didn't understand at the time but that he recognized as being old, very old. The stone carried a message that somehow my grandfather's mind could process despite the alien script. Trade. The implication was clear. The mountains had the hiker. They would return him. But they wanted something in exchange. Something precious. Something that carried weight in the human world. I had an artifact, my grandfather explained. Our family's medicine bundle. It had belonged to our ancestors for more than 200 years. It was sacred, but it was also an object. It was also material. He paused. I made the calculation that my spiritual traditions could survive the loss of the bundle. But that young man couldn't survive the loss of his life. He'd taken the artifact to the high marker. He'd left it at the cairn. He'd walked away. He didn't look back. 3 days later, the missing hiker appeared at the ranger station in the town below. He'd walked out of the mountains on his own, exhausted, confused, but alive. He had no memory of his time in the high terrain. He couldn't explain how he'd survived. He just knew that he'd been lost. And then he was found. I thought it was done, my grandfather said. I thought I'd made the trade. I thought the debt was settled. It's not settled, I said. They want it back. Or they want something else. My grandfather stood up with visible effort and disappeared into the house. He returned with an object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, reverently. It was a bone, or something like bone. It was pale yellow, maybe 4 inches long, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift depending on the angle of light. It didn't look like a human bone. It was too delicate, too precisely formed. It was the kind of object that should have been in a museum or a university collection, not hidden away in an old man's cabin. This is what I gave them, my grandfather said. This is what they took. And this is what they're asking me to return. What is it? David asked. I don't know, my grandfather admitted. I've never known. When I found it, I was maybe 30 years old. I was exploring caves in the high country. I found this in a sealed chamber, along with other artifacts. I recognized something sacred about it, so I kept it. I thought it was from an ancient burial site. Later I wondered if maybe it was something else, something older than our people. David took the bone and examined it closely. This isn't human, he said. I'm not an anthropologist, but I can say with certainty this isn't human. The structure is all wrong. No, my grandfather agreed. It isn't human. I think it might be what they are, or what they were. I think I took a piece of one of them from that cave. and I've been carrying it for decades without understanding. The implications settled on us like weight. You took one of them, I said slowly. You took a piece of something that belongs to them. And when the mountains demanded a trade, you gave them your family's sacred object instead of what they really wanted, instead of what they were probably asking for. I didn't have another choice, my grandfather said, his voice heavy. A human life was on the line. But they're not asking for the medicine bundle, I said. They're asking for something to be returned. They're asking for what you actually took. David was already making calculations on his phone. If the entity took your grandfather's bundle as a substitute trade, but what they actually want is this bone, then you've been in violation of the agreement for 30 years. Each year the debt compounds. Each year they're waiting. The subsonic vibration, the awakening, the messages in the cairns, the figures moving through the mountains. They're getting organized, I said. They're escalating. They're tired of waiting. My grandfather held the bone in his hand, staring at it like it might suddenly animate and attack him. I can't return it, he said softly. If I return it, I don't know what happens. I don't know if they'll be satisfied with the exchange. I don't know if the debt will be settled or if it will be considered an affront that I've been holding it all this time. You have to, David said, because if you don't, they're going to escalate further. And the park ranger population isn't prepared for a full incursion from the high terrain. People are going to die. My grandfather looked at me. What do you think, Dakota? You're the one who spent 13 years in the mountain. You're the one who carries the ranger's role. You're the one who stands at the boundary. I didn't know. How could I know? This was beyond the scope of my training, my experience, my understanding. But I had felt their presence. I had seen them move. I had felt the communication they'd sent, and I knew that they were getting impatient. We return it, I said. Tonight, at marker 47. Where this all began. That's the boundary point, my grandfather said. They don't cross the boundary. No, David said, understanding. But we can meet them there. We can place the bone in the cairn and let them take it. That's neutral ground. We drove back to the park in the dark. My grandfather sat in the front seat, his old hands cradling the wrapped bone like it might shatter. The subsonic vibration was present even outside the park boundaries, getting stronger as we drove closer. At base camp, I found Marcus waiting. He'd been monitoring the sensors. The thermal signatures on the ridge were moving. They were converging on marker 47. They were waiting. You're going up there? He asked, when I explained what we were doing. Someone has to, I said, and it has to be him. We assembled a small team, myself, my grandfather, David, and Marcus, for operational support. Sarah offered to join us, but I told her to stay at base camp and monitor communications. Someone needed to be in contact with the ranger stations, ready to issue emergency protocols if things went wrong. The hike to marker 47 in darkness was surreal. Our flashlights carved tunnels through the black. The trees loomed like sentinels. The wind carried sounds that weren't quite animal, weren't quite wind. We reached the cairn at 11:47 p.m. The stones gleamed under our lights. Behind the cairn, in the darkness just beyond our sight, I could feel them, waiting, watching, present in a way that was almost physical. My grandfather approached the cairn alone. He moved slowly, his 78-year-old body showing every one of those years. He placed the wrapped bone at the base of the cairn. He stood there for a moment, his hand touching the stones, his lips moving in a language I didn't understand. Then he stepped back. For several seconds, nothing happened. The wind died. The night became absolutely still. And then, in a movement so fast that I couldn't track it, the bone was gone. The cloth it had been wrapped in fell to the ground, empty. They had taken it. For a long moment we stood there, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for them to extract additional payment, waiting for the violation of the boundary that seemed inevitable. But it didn't come. Instead, the subsonic vibration changed. It modulated. The bone-deep resonance that had been building for days slowly decreased. The pressure that I'd been feeling in my skull, in my sinuses, in the back of my eyes, it all slowly released like a pressure valve being opened. It's done, my grandfather said. The debt is settled. We didn't celebrate. We didn't feel relief exactly. What we felt was the absence of imminent dread, the sense that something that had been wound tight was finally being allowed to relax. The return hike was silent. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. At base camp, Marcus was monitoring the sensors. They're moving back up the ridge, he reported, heading for the high terrain. They're not approaching the boundary anymore. They're satisfied, David said. Over the next few days, the official reports came in. The regional office classified the incident as a perimeter fauna anomaly. Whatever had been seen, whatever had happened, it was being categorized as something that could fit within the existing framework of understanding. A cryptid, perhaps, or a previously unidentified species, or a hallucination caused by environmental toxins. Walter Finch was transferred to a long-term care facility. His mind had been fundamentally altered by his time in the high terrain. He would never recover. He spent his remaining years staring at walls, occasionally making those clicking sounds, the same sounds Dr. Reyes had made, the same sounds I've heard in my nightmares since that night. My grandfather returned to his cabin. He didn't speak much after the exchange at Marker 47. I think a part of him died when he released the bone back to its owners. Or maybe it was the opposite. Maybe a part of him was finally freed. As for me, I remained a ranger in the Alpacha Mountains. But everything changed. The boundary markers were updated with new coordinates. The protocols were rewritten to account for a more active presence in the high terrain, and I was given a new responsibility. I became the primary liaison between the Park Service and whatever lived in the mountains. Essentially, I became the ambassador to something that shouldn't exist. My grandfather told me before he died, 2 years after the exchange, that the bones I'd returned were the only piece of them that had ever existed outside the high terrain. They had been taken decades ago by someone long dead. He'd never discovered who, but he suspected the thief had suffered the same escalating consequences we'd witnessed. The debt had simply transferred to him when he found the bone. The mountains have a long memory, he told me, and they don't forgive debts. They compound them. That's what I should have understood when I made the exchange. That's what I should have told you before you took the ranger oath. 2 weeks before his death, I asked him, "Do you regret it? Saving that hiker instead of returning the bone immediately?" He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "I regret that there was ever a choice to make, but given the choice, I would make it again. A human life is always worth the debt. Always. You remember that? When your time comes to make the calculation?" The hiker my grandfather saved, his name was Jason Foster, went on to live a relatively normal life. He never remembered the mountains, never remembered the time he spent in the high terrain, and as far as I know, he's never felt the presence of that world brushing up against his own reality. But I feel it every day. I feel it when I'm on patrol and the wind moves wrong. I feel it when I see shadows that don't quite align with their objects. I feel it in the subsonic frequency that will never fully disappear from my perception. The boundary holds now. The agreement is honored. They stay in the high terrain. We stay below the markers. And we don't return to the places where the rocks don't have shadows. But I know it's temporary. I know that debts in that place are never truly settled. I know that whatever walked these mountains for thousands of years will eventually come calling again. Will eventually decide that the balance has shifted. Will eventually find a new reason to ask for something to be returned. And when that happens, there will be another ranger standing at marker 47. There will be another choice to make between saving a human life and maintaining the debt. There will be another calculation. I hope whoever that ranger is makes the choice my grandfather made. I hope they understand that some prices are worth paying, even if those prices never fully stop accumulating. That's what I've learned from 13 years on the ridge. That's what I understand now about the mountains and the boundaries and the things that wait in places where the light doesn't quite reach. That's the real meaning of the message carved in the stones. Return what was taken. It's not a demand. It's a promise, because something somewhere will always be owed, and the mountains never forget a debt. Fei Puol. The first thing I noticed was that the birds had stopped singing 3 days before Hudson disappeared. I was cutting wood behind my cabin when I realized the silence, not the normal winter quiet. I'm used to that. The winter Appalachian silence is peaceful, almost meditative. This was different. This was the sound of something missing. The chickadees that usually navigate the bare branches even in December. The crows that would normally gather at the deer carcasses we left for scavengers. All gone, all absent. It wasn't until Thursday night, sitting by the fire, that I understood what the silence meant. The animals knew something was wrong. Hudson had come to my place that Wednesday. He was a lean man in his late 50s, weathered in the way that comes from a lifetime in the mountains. Not a hiker, not an outdoors enthusiast. Just someone who'd been born and raised in these hills and had never left, despite or perhaps because of all the reasons he should have. He worked occasional jobs, carpentry, sometimes labor, but mostly he existed in the way longtime mountain people do. He knew the terrain, knew which creeks ran clean and which had iron in the water. knew which ridges were safe to travel at night and which weren't. He came to me because he needed help moving materials to his property, a shed that his father had built in 1987 that he wanted to relocate. The work would take a day, maybe two. I agreed. Hudson had helped me with my roof 5 years prior, so I owed him. We started Wednesday morning. The temperature was around 28 degrees, a hard freeze but clear, the kind of day where the air seems more solid than liquid. We worked until the lights started failing around 4 p.m. Hudson said he'd come back Thursday morning and we could finish the job. He never came. I assumed he'd gotten cold or decided the work could wait until spring. But Thursday morning, when I was preparing coffee, I found myself thinking about the birds, about the absence, about the particular quality of silence that feels like something is waiting. I called his place around 9 a.m., no answer. I called again at noon, still nothing. By 2 o'clock, I made the decision to hike the 1.5 miles to his cabin to check on him. The path to Hudson's place runs along Deadwater Creek, a stream that runs year-round but gets sluggish in winter, moving under a thin crust of ice that breaks and reforms depending on the temperature fluctuations. The walk is usually pleasant. This day it wasn't. This day the forest felt deliberate in its emptiness. The trees weren't just bare, they seemed to be watching. I'm not someone who usually acknowledges supernatural feelings. I'm practical. I work with my hands. I understand cause and effect. But that walk to Hudson's cabin produced a sensation I couldn't rationalize away. I was being observed by something that didn't have conventional eyes. Hudson's cabin came into view around 3 p.m. The smoke wasn't rising from the chimney, which was odd. His truck was in the drive. So was his propane delivery vehicle from Wednesday afternoon. The tank had been filled, which meant Hudson had been home at least that long. "Hudson," I shouted, approaching the door. "You home?" No answer. I tried the handle. Unlocked. The interior was maybe 45 degrees. The fire had gone out at least 12 hours prior. The cabin smelled wrong, not like decay, like something chemical, like metal and copper and something underneath both of those that made my sinuses burn. "Hudson?" I searched the small space. Bedroom empty. Kitchen empty. Bathroom had towels on the floor, but no signs of struggle or distress. The back door was open. The snow beyond the threshold was disturbed, but not in any pattern I could interpret. It looked like something had moved through it, not human footprints, but something broader, something that had displaced the snow in a way that suggested bipedal movement, but with a stride length that was wrong. I followed the trail. This is where I should have stopped. Where any person with sense would have stopped, closed the cabin door, walked back to my place, and called the sheriff. But I didn't. I followed the tracks into the forest that backs Hudson's property. The trail was maybe 30 meters long before I found him. Hudson was still alive. That was the first shock. He was standing in a small clearing, facing away from me, perfectly motionless. His clothing was torn. His exposed skin had a grayish tint that suggested either extreme cold or something worse. His hands were hanging at his sides, and they were shaking, not trembling from cold, but vibrating at a frequency that looked almost mechanical. "Hudson," I said, my voice wavering. "Hudson, what happened?" He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge that I'd spoken. His entire body was locked in a posture of absolute stillness except for those shaking hands. I approached slowly. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to leave, but my brain wasn't processing that information correctly. I was in problem-solving mode. Someone I knew was in distress. Help them. When I got close enough to see his face, I stopped moving. Hudson's eyes were open, but there was nothing in them. Not blankness exactly, but a quality of absolute absence. His mouth was slightly open. His jaw was moving minutely, grinding, like he was chewing something that wouldn't break down. "Hudson, I'm calling for help." I pulled my phone from my pocket. That's when he spoke. Not words exactly. The sounds his mouth made approximated language, but the phonetics were wrong. The timbre was wrong. It was like his larynx was producing frequencies it wasn't designed for. "Not take, not yours, not." I stepped back. I was walking backward now, my eyes on Hudson's form. "Stay back from Hudson's place. Stay back from the creek. Stay back from the high stones." The sounds came again, shaped somewhat into language but still fundamentally wrong. "The burning is coming. The hunger is waiting. Do not be here when the night falls and the long dark begins." "Hudson." He turned, slowly, with movements that seemed to require conscious effort from every joint. His face was his face. His eyes were his eyes, but the proportions had changed. The space between his features was too wide. His jaw extended lower than it should. His skin had taken on a texture like leather that had been left in water too long. "Hudson is gone," the thing wearing Hudson's body said. Hudson went to the high stones to find the caves. Hudson went because he heard the call. Hudson went and Hudson found what calls. Now Hudson is here and Hudson is waiting. I ran. I ran back through the forest without looking back, without checking my footing, with every part of my body convinced that something was chasing me. I didn't hear pursuit, but I didn't stop running until I was at my cabin with all the doors locked and every light turned on. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my grandfather's rifle across my lap and monitored every sound. Around midnight, I called the sheriff's office. I reported Hudson missing. I told them he was confused and possibly injured. I didn't tell them about what his face had looked like or about the sounds his mouth had made. The sheriff's deputies found Hudson's body the next morning in the clearing where I'd seen him. They said he'd been dead for at least 24 hours. Exposure, probably. He'd wandered into the woods in the cold and couldn't find his way back. The coroner later confirmed he'd died of hypothermia, though there were other findings that concerned him. Signs of severe malnutrition despite Hudson's relatively healthy appearance, unusual bruising on the internal organs, and something the coroner described as advanced muscular degeneration in areas we wouldn't typically see it in post-mortem cases. I attended the funeral. I listened to people talk about Hudson as a good man, a reliable friend, someone who understood the mountains. I stood in the cemetery in the freezing rain and watched them lower his body into the ground, and I thought about the way his jaw had extended and the way his eyes had gone flat. 2 days after the funeral, I found tracks in the snow around my property. Large tracks, bipedal, spaced too far apart to be human. I've lived in the Appalachian Mountains for 43 years. I was born here, in a hospital in a town that hardly qualifies as a town. My parents were mountain people. My grandparents were mountain people. The mountains are in my blood in the way that soil becomes part of a plant's structure. But I'd never heard the stories about the deep winter creature. The thing that the really old people didn't talk about directly, that they referred to in circumlocution and suggestion. It took me 3 days of investigating, calling people I hadn't spoken to in years, traveling to the neighboring county to visit my great-uncle in an assisted living facility, before I found someone willing to speak directly about it. Thomas was 94 years old. He'd lived in these mountains his entire life, and his mind was still sharp despite his body's deterioration. I sat beside his bed in that fluorescent room that smelled of antiseptic and human decline, and I asked him about the creature. "There's a thing that comes," he said slowly, his ancient eyes focused on the ceiling. "Not every winter, not even every decade, but sometimes when the cold gets particular, when the snow gets deep and the hunger gets deep, it comes down from the high places, comes looking for what it can take." "What is it?" I asked. "Something old," Thomas said. "Older than us. It was here before the Cherokee came through. Might have been here before humans came at all. It's not a bear. It's not a mountain lion. It's something that walks like we walk but thinks different, hunts different." "What does it do?" Thomas turned his head slowly to look at me. "It eats," he said, "but not like animals eat. It doesn't want meat so much as it wants presence. It takes people, makes them wrong. And if you're not careful, if you don't know the old ways of staying safe, you end up being what it wears." What it wears. The phrase chilled me more than any of the rest. When it takes someone, really takes them, the person doesn't die immediate. The thing gets inside them, wears them, uses them to communicate sometimes, uses them to walk in places that it couldn't go otherwise. Hudson probably felt it coming before it got to him. Probably heard it in his head for days, probably went up to the high stones like it was calling to him, because it was calling to him. Thomas told me about the precautions. The salt left at property boundaries. The iron nails driven into door frames. The specific prayers, not Christian prayers exactly, but something older, something that predated organized religion. He told me about the things you didn't do. You didn't look at it directly if you encountered it. You didn't speak its name because speaking a name gave it attention and attention gave it power. You didn't go to the high places during the winter solstice month, but mostly, he told me, you were careful about hunger. "The thing understands hunger better than anything alive," Thomas said. "It is hunger, pure, perfect hunger. If you're starving, it can smell it. If you're lonely, it can smell it. If there's something in you that's empty, the thing knows how to fill it. And once it fills you, you belong to it." I left Thomas's care facility with a terrible understanding settling into my chest. Hudson hadn't been predisposed to being taken. Hudson had been hungry in a way that I hadn't recognized. He was alone, he was aging, He was in the way that long-term mountain residents sometimes become profoundly isolated, and the thing in the high places knew how to exploit that isolation. That night I began the preparations Thomas had described. I bought salt, 12 bags of it. I positioned it along the perimeter of my property in a line that faced the direction of the high stones. I found iron nails, the old kind, the kind my grandfather had used on his property, and I drove them into the frame of every door and window, and I waited. For 2 weeks nothing happened. The tracks stopped appearing. The silence in the forest gradually returned to normal as the birds came back. Life seemed to resume. I told myself that I'd overreacted, that Hudson's death was simply tragedy, that the story Thomas had told was cultural mythology rather than literal truth. On day 15 I heard it singing. The sound came at 2 in the morning. I was awake. I'd been sleeping poorly for weeks, and at first I thought it was the wind. But wind doesn't sing with intention. Wind doesn't produce the specific tonal qualities of something trying to form words. I went to the window and looked out into the darkness. The thing was standing at the edge of my property, just beyond the salt line I'd created. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its silhouette suggested something humanoid, but with proportions that were deeply, fundamentally wrong. The head was too small. The arms were too long. The legs bent at angles that suggested joints my body didn't have, and it was singing to me. The song wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but I could understand it. Not the words, the meaning. It was singing about hunger, about the cold, deep places, about the things that live in caves where light never reaches and the walls are made of stone older than continents. It was singing about the way it felt to wear a human body, the strange sensation of articulated joints and delicate skin. It was singing about its desire to wear me. I grabbed the rifle. I pointed it at the shape and pulled the trigger. The shot was impossibly loud in the winter night. The thing didn't move. The bullet passed through the space where it was standing and there was no reaction, no sound, no movement. It just remained there, perfectly still, perfectly present. I fired again, and again. The rifle bucked in my hands. The smell of cordite filled the cabin, and the thing remained, watching me with whatever sensory apparatus it used in place of eyes. Then it turned and walked back toward the high stones. I didn't sleep after that. I sat with the rifle and watched the eastern sky lighten, watching the sun come up over the mountains with the desperate hope that daylight would bring safety. It did, in a way. The presence receded. The immediate threat passed. But I understood watching that sunrise that the salt line and the iron nails weren't walls. They were suggestions. They were requests for the thing to stay away, and requests could be refused. 3 weeks after the incident with the singing, I made my decision. I couldn't live in the cabin anymore. The mountains that had been my home for 43 years had become something else. Not hostile exactly, but no longer safe. Not hostile, but aware of me in a way that I couldn't reciprocate or defend against. I began packing. I called a realtor in town and listed the property. I told no one about my reasons for leaving. I simply began the process of disconnecting myself from the mountains. On the day before I was set to leave, I received a visitor. The woman was in her mid-70s, dressed in clothes that looked handmade. I'd never seen her before, but she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in the mountains. She walked directly to my door without hesitation. "You need to know something before you leave," she said without preamble. "About Hudson, about what he became." I let her inside. Her name was Eleanor. She'd known Hudson for most of her life. They'd been close in the way that mountain people get close, not through frequent contact or conversation, but through a shared understanding of the terrain and the old ways. "Hudson was hungry," Eleanor said, sitting at my kitchen table. "Not for food, for purpose, for meaning. He'd spent 30 years doing work that didn't matter, being in places that didn't challenge him, living in a way that had narrowed down to just existing. He was hollow. The thing in the high places, it feeds on that hollowness. It reaches into the empty spaces we make inside ourselves, and it fills them with something that feels like purpose." "He was taken," I said. "He was invited," Eleanor corrected, "and he accepted. That's what you need to understand. Hudson isn't suffering. Hudson isn't trapped. Hudson has become part of something larger than his individual existence. The thing wearing Hudson's body, it's not a parasite that's destroyed him. It's a partnership that he accepted, on some level of his consciousness, the moment he heard it calling." "That's insane," I said. "You're describing possession." "I'm describing hunger meeting emptiness," Eleanor said. "I'm describing the way humans have always been drawn to things that promise to fill the hollow places in us. The thing in the high places is just very good at it. Better than religion, better than family, better than love. It promises complete belonging, complete purpose, and it delivers on that promise, right up until the moment it consumes you entirely. She stood to leave. "You're leaving the mountains," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "Good," Eleanor said, "because if you stayed it would eventually succeed. And you're hollow too. You've been hollow for longer than Hudson. The mountains made you hollow the day you chose to stay in them instead of seeking connection with other people. The thing can smell that about you. It would wear you like a favorite coat." She left before I could respond. I finished packing that night. I spent my last morning in the cabin I'd lived in for over 20 years, the mountains I'd known my entire life. The birds were singing, the sun was warm on the windows, everything seemed normal, but I knew the truth now. The mountains weren't home. They were a place where hunger lived. They were where things came to feed on the empty spaces that we create inside ourselves when we isolate too completely. At the last moment, before I drove away, I looked back at the high stones rising against the sky. I thought I saw a figure standing there, tall and wrong proportioned, watching me leave. I didn't look long enough to be certain. I just got in my vehicle and drove. I've been gone for 8 months now. I live in a different state. I work at a job that requires collaboration and constant human interaction. I've started going to community events. I've tried to fill the hollow places with other people, other connections. It helps. But sometimes at night I hear something in the wind that sounds like singing. And I remember Hudson's face, the way it stretched and changed, the hollow look in his eyes before the thing inside him began to speak. And I understand that running might not be enough. That hunger like that doesn't forget. That having been called once, I'm marked. The thing in the high places knows my shape, knows the smell of my emptiness, and eventually, mountains or no mountains, it will find where I've gone. The winter solstice comes every year. The mountains are always there waiting. And hunger, according to Thomas, is eternal. I've started learning the old prayers, started keeping salt in my home, started being deliberate about never being empty, never being alone, never letting the hollow spaces grow too vast, because the thing that took Hudson is still out there, and it's patient. It's got all the time that the mountains have had, and mountains are very, very old. Sometimes I think Hudson is still here too. That part of me that can't deny the old stories thinks that Hudson is in the high places still, that he's part of that hunger now, that he's part of the thing that calls to people who are hollow enough to listen. And if there's any truth to that, then I should probably stop speaking his name, because speaking names gives things attention, and attention gives them power. And the thing in the mountains already has too much power over me as it is. The moment I realized Sarah wasn't in the car anymore, I understood that something fundamental had shifted in the world. That moment lasted less than a second, the time it took for the headlights to illuminate the empty passenger seat, the airbag deflated and hanging like a failed prophecy. But that second contained the entire arc of my life being divided into before and after. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. when I regained consciousness. The impact had happened minutes before that, though I couldn't remember it. Unconsciousness is like that. It erases the transition so you have no memory of the moment your body stopped moving or the sound of metal tearing open. You just wake up, and everything is different. The crash was my fault. I wasn't paying attention to the road. I was paying attention to Sarah, to her hand on my thigh, to the way she was laughing at something I'd said about my work. We were driving Route 19 through the mountains near Mount Vista, heading back to our apartment in Charleston after a weekend camping trip. The weather was clear, the road was dry. There was no reason for us to be off the road at all, except I'd swerved. I remembered that part. The sensation of the wheel jerking in my hands, the instinctive panic as the car tilted, the weightlessness as we left the asphalt. I'd swerved because I'd seen something in the road, something large, something that stood upright on two legs in the middle of Route 19 at nearly midnight, looking directly at the car. The police officer who arrived on scene said there was no animal. He said the physical evidence suggested I'd simply lost control, maybe I'd been drowsy, maybe I'd been distracted. He implied the second option by looking at Sarah, who was standing beside the car in a borrowed jacket, shaking. "Where is she?" I asked the officer. His name tag said Mitchell. "Where is who, sir?" Officer Mitchell was filling out his report, not looking at me. "My girlfriend. Sarah, she was in the passenger seat. Where did she go? Officer Mitchell looked at me with the expression people use when they're trying to assess whether you're a danger to yourself or others. Sir, you were alone in the vehicle when the fire department arrived, the only occupant. That's what the first responders reported. I looked at Sarah, who was standing 30 feet away talking to a paramedic. She was definitely there. She was definitely whole and unharmed. So either Officer Mitchell was wrong or, I need to talk to Sarah, I said. The paramedic insisted on running tests. Concussion protocol, they called it. I had a cut on my temple, some bruising on my shoulder from the seatbelt, but nothing serious. My memory was fine. My cognitive function was fine. I knew where I was, what year it was, who the president was. I passed every test they gave me, but when I described what I'd seen in the road, the large upright shape, the way it had turned to look at the car, the paramedic exchanged a glance with Officer Mitchell. There's no wildlife in these mountains that matches that description, the paramedic said. His name tag said Foster. You probably saw a deer or maybe a bear standing up, and in the darkness and with the headlights it looked bigger than it was. It wasn't a deer, I said. It wasn't a bear. It was, I don't know what it was. But it was intelligent. It was looking at us. Sarah, when I finally got to talk to her alone, seemed oddly reluctant to discuss what she'd seen. I was looking at my phone, she said. I didn't see anything. I just felt the impact, and then I was being helped out of the car by the paramedics. You didn't see anything at all? No. Nothing. You didn't feel the car swerve. You didn't hear me react. Sarah looked away. I was listening to music. I had my earbuds in. I didn't know what happened until it was over. This was consistent with what she'd told Officer Mitchell, so it should have reassured me. Instead, it made me more certain that something was wrong. Sarah was lying. Not obviously, but the small hesitations in her speech, the way her eyes tracked away from mine, the tightness in her jaw. These were tells I recognized from years of knowing her. The tow truck arrived, and they took the car away. Officer Mitchell said we were free to leave and suggested we seek immediate medical attention if we developed any symptoms of concussion. He didn't charge me with anything, didn't even cite me for reckless driving. The whole encounter had the feeling of something being smoothly redirected, normalized, made to vanish into the category of accident rather than incident. A friend from work picked us up and drove us to Charleston. Sarah slept against the window the whole way. I stayed awake, replaying the moment over and over in my head, trying to remember exactly what I'd seen. The shape had been massive, that much I was certain of. At least 7 feet tall, probably more. The proportions had been humanoid. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head, but wrong. The arms had seemed too long. The head had been too small for the body, or the body too large for the head. I couldn't quite remember which. And the eyes. There had been eyes, and they'd caught the headlight beams and reflected them back, bright and reflective like a cat's eyes, and full of an intelligence that was vast and predatory and completely alien to anything I'd ever encountered. In the days that followed, I tried to move on. I went back to work. I'm a software engineer for a logistics company, work that requires concentration and focus. I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the creature, about why it had been in the road, about what it had wanted. On the 3rd day after the accident, I called Route 19 Animal Control and reported the incident. The man I spoke to listened politely, then told me that they'd had no reports of unusual wildlife in the area. He said the accident was likely due to fatigue or momentary inattention. He didn't sound like he was lying. He sounded like he genuinely believed this, which was worse somehow than if he'd been deliberately misleading me. That night, I did something I should not have done. I drove back to the location of the accident. The crash site was unmarked, just a section of shoulder where the guardrail had been bent outward, and a long scar of dark soil where the car had left the road. The darkness was absolute. The nearest town, Mount Vista, was 7 miles away. Out here, at night, with only the headlights of the car to push back the darkness, the mountains felt completely alien. I turned off the engine and waited. The silence was so complete it felt like a sound itself, the sound of absolutely nothing, which is a very different thing from the sound of ambient noise. There were no crickets, no nightbirds, no rustling of animals in the brush. Just the wind moving through the dead trees and the faint sound of Route 19 somewhere miles away with its occasional traffic. I waited for an hour, then 2. I knew I was being irrational. I knew that sitting in a car in the dark on a mountain road in the middle of the night hoping to encounter the thing that had caused my accident was the opposite of rational decision-making. And then I heard it, not the creature itself, not at first. What I heard was a sound like fabric tearing, a long ripping sound that echoed across the mountains. And underneath that sound was a lower frequency, something almost inaudible that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. I turned off the car's interior light and got out. The air was cold, probably 40 degrees, and it smelled wrong. There was an odor like oil and decay and something organic that had been dead for too long. The smell made my stomach convulse. The sound came again, the tearing fabric sound, louder this time, and I realized I was hearing wings. Something with wings so large, so powerful, that the sound of them moving through the air created that distinctive ripping sound. I saw it then, just barely, silhouetted against the starlight. The shape was enormous. The wings stretched across what must have been a 12-foot span, maybe more. The body was humanoid but grotesquely wrong, the proportions of a human but the musculature of something that didn't exist in nature. The head was small and pointed, tilted upward, and the eyes, those same reflective eyes I'd seen in my headlights, were focused directly on me. The creature descended. It didn't land, it simply moved lower, dropping perhaps 20 feet until it was hovering just above the road, its massive wings beating with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound they made was like thunder, like the sky tearing open. I should have run. I should have gotten in the car and driven away. Instead, I stood there, frozen, staring at the impossible thing in front of me. The creature made a sound, not a roar, not a shriek, but something between the two, a vocalization so alien and so full of wrongness that my brain couldn't properly process it. My body reacted without my conscious consent. My bladder emptied, my legs began to shake, my vision narrowed to tunnel focus, and in that moment I understood that the creature was studying me. Just as I was studying it, it was studying me, evaluating me, deciding what to do about this small human figure that had returned to the site of their previous encounter. Then headlights appeared in the distance. A vehicle was approaching along Route 19, moving fast. The creature's head snapped around toward the light, and for just a moment, I wasn't the center of its attention anymore. That moment was enough. I ran to my car, got in, and started the engine. The creature's wings beat harder, creating a sound like the world cracking open, but it didn't follow. It simply rose higher, moving away from the approaching vehicle, disappearing into the darkness above the trees. The vehicle that had caused the creature to retreat was a state police car. It passed without slowing down, the trooper inside probably unaware that he'd just interrupted an encounter between a human and something that shouldn't exist. I drove away at a speed that was probably dangerous. I drove for an hour, until I was back in civilization, until there were lights and other cars and the basic infrastructure of human existence. And even then I didn't feel safe. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to tell Sarah what I'd seen. I wasn't going to tell anyone, because if I did, I would be moved into a category of people, the crazy people, the conspiracy theorists, the ones who had experiences that couldn't be explained and therefore couldn't be acknowledged. But more importantly, I was terrified. Not of the creature itself, though that terror was certainly present. I was terrified of the knowledge I now possessed. The creature was real. It existed, and it had come to Route 19, to that specific location, on the night that Sarah and I had crashed. That couldn't be coincidence. The creature had been in the road on purpose. It had wanted us to crash. The question was, why? Sarah left me 3 weeks after the accident. She didn't give a clear reason. She said she needed space, needed time to think, needed to figure out what she wanted. But I knew the real reason. Something had changed in the crash. Something had been taken, or something had been left behind, and Sarah didn't want to be around me while whatever it was worked itself out. I tried to ask her directly, did something happen to you in the car, during the crash? Something you haven't told me about. She wouldn't answer. She just packed a bag and went to stay with her sister in Pittsburgh, and 2 weeks later I got an email from a lawyer saying she wanted a divorce. I didn't fight it. I signed the papers, and Sarah became my ex-wife, and I became a person living alone in an apartment in Charleston, working a job I didn't care about, waiting for something I couldn't name. The creature came back on a Thursday night in January. I knew it was coming about an hour before it arrived. I felt it, the way you feel a storm approaching, a change in air pressure that sets your teeth on edge and makes your skin crawl. I was at work late, finishing up a project, when the feeling hit me so hard that I had to leave the office. I drove to Mount Vista without really deciding to do so. My body seemed to be moving on autopilot, my hands guiding the car up the mountain roads, taking turns without conscious thought. By the time I arrived at the crash site, It was nearly midnight, the same time as the original accident. The creature was waiting. It was perched on the guardrail, its wings folded against its back, its small pointed head tilted as if it had been expecting me. Up close in the beam of my headlights I could see details I'd missed before. The skin was dark gray, almost black, and it had a texture like leather. The wings, when they moved slightly in the cold air, showed an intricate pattern of veins, like the wings of an insect scaled up to monstrous proportions. The face was the worst part. It was humanoid enough to be recognizable as a variation on human features, but the variations were profound. The eyes were enormous, taking up almost half the head, and they were solid black except for 2 points of reflected light that never moved, never blinked. The nose was almost vestigial, just 2 small holes. The mouth, when it opened, revealed teeth that seemed to continue back impossibly far into the throat. "What do you want?" I called out. I don't know why I expected it to answer. It wasn't human. It wouldn't understand English, wouldn't have any interest in human communication, but it did understand. The creature's head cocked sideways, and it made a sound, that same tearing fabric sound but gentler this time, almost inquisitive. Then it spoke. I know how that sounds. I know how insane it is to claim that a creature like that, something so fundamentally alien, could produce human speech, but it did. The words came out of that impossible throat in a voice that sounded like 2 surfaces grinding together, but the words were clear, unmistakable English. "Where is she?" the creature said. Its voice had no inflection, no emotion, just those 2 words repeated over and over. "Where is she? Where is she? Where is she?" I understood then what had happened in the car. Sarah wasn't gone, she'd been taken. Something about the crash, about the moment of impact, had been the opening the creature needed. It had taken her, and it had left her body in the car, or left something that looked enough like her body that I couldn't tell the difference. But the essential thing that made her Sarah, the thing that was consciousness and personality and identity, that had been removed. "What did you do to her?" I demanded. "What did you take?" The creature unfurled its wings. They were even larger when they were spread out, spanning nearly 15 feet from tip to tip. In the headlights they were translucent, and I could see the intricate pattern of veins clearly. They were beautiful and horrible at the same time. "She volunteered," the creature said. "She asked to be taken. She asked to be made new." "That's a lie," I said. "She wouldn't." "I can show you," the creature interrupted. "I can show you what she's become. I can show you what you could become." The creature flew down from the guardrail and landed on the hood of my car. The weight of it dented the metal, and I heard the windshield crack under the pressure of its talons. It leaned toward me, its enormous eyes filling my vision, and I saw something in those eyes that looked almost like pity. "She's happy," the creature said. "Happier than she ever was as a human. Happier than you're capable of being because you lack the capacity for joy that she now possesses. Do you want to understand what that feels like?" I threw the car into reverse and backed away, the creature's talons scraping across the hood as it tried to maintain its grip. I accelerated, doing 40 miles an hour backward, which was stupid and dangerous and absolutely necessary. The creature took to the air. It didn't pursue me, though it easily could have. It simply rose higher and higher, its wings beating against the darkness, until it was silhouetted against the stars. And then it was gone, dissolved into the night as if it had never existed. I drove back to Charleston doing 90 miles an hour. I drove directly to the police station. The officer who took my report was the same Officer Mitchell who had responded to my original accident. He listened to my description of the creature, made notes, and then asked me when I had last slept. "I slept last night," I said. "Have you been drinking?" "No." "Have you experienced any significant trauma recently? Any life changes? Any stress?" I understood what he was doing. He was building a profile of someone who was unreliable, someone whose testimony couldn't be trusted. He was already preparing the explanation for why my account would be dismissed. "My wife left me," I said. "My ex-wife, I mean. We're getting divorced. But that's not—" "And that didn't distress you?" "Of course it distressed me, but—" "And you've been alone since?" "Spending a lot of time thinking about the accident, replaying it in your mind, wondering if you could have done something differently." He was good, very good. He was making me sound like a grieving, paranoid person manufacturing explanations for events that had more mundane causes. If I'd been listening to someone else tell this story, I probably would have believed him. "There was a creature on the road," I said, "in the middle of Route 19. It was massive. It had wings. It spoke English. I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you the truth." Officer Mitchell closed his notebook. "I think what you need is to talk to someone, a professional." someone who can help you process what's happened. The address is on this card. They have availability this week." The card was for a therapist, not a psychiatrist, I noted, but the implication was clear. Officer Mitchell thought I was mentally unwell, and he was trying to help by redirecting me to mental health services. I left the police station. I knew it was futile to pursue it further. The authorities had already decided what had happened. I'd had an accident, I'd suffered some minor head trauma, and now I was experiencing psychological repercussions manifesting as delusions. The existence of the creature, the reality of what I'd experienced, none of that mattered. The official narrative had been established, and I was being moved toward the margins where my testimony could be safely ignored. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I researched the creature. What I found on the internet was a mixture of folklore, speculation, and accounts that matched my experience with an accuracy that was chilling. The creature was called Mothman. It had been reported in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in 1966, seen by hundreds of people over a period of several months. The sightings had eventually stopped, and the creature had disappeared from history, relegated to the category of cryptid, something that might exist but could never be proven. But then there were the newer reports, scattered accounts from hiking forums, conspiracy theory websites, and subreddits dedicated to unexplained phenomena. People claiming to have seen it in isolated areas of the Appalachian Mountains, people claiming to have encountered it on lonely roads, and people claiming, like I was claiming, that the creature could speak, that it could interact with humans, that it was taking people. One account particularly stood out. It was posted 5 years ago by someone with the username Lost Mountain. They described an encounter with Mothman in the mountains near Asheville, North Carolina. They said that the creature had taken their daughter during a camping trip, that their daughter had returned physically intact but fundamentally changed, that she was no longer the person she had been. She says she chose to go with it, the post said. She says being human was like being colorblind your whole life and then suddenly seeing in full spectrum. She says she can't go back to being what she was, and doesn't want to. If you're reading this because you're experiencing something similar, understand that what's happening is real, and that there's nothing you can do to stop it. Only prepare yourself for the possibility that you'll have to live with what you've lost. I reached out to that account. The message I sent was probably futile. 5 years was a long time, and the user might not check their messages, but I had to try. To my surprise, they responded within hours. Their real name was Leo Garrison. He agreed to talk to me on the phone, and we spent 3 hours discussing Mothman, discussing the nature of what it took from people, discussing the strange way it seemed to target individuals and gradually draw them into its sphere of influence. It doesn't hunt randomly, Leo said. It's selective. It finds people who are unstable, people with dissatisfaction in their lives. It offers them something better, a transformation, a becoming. And once it offers, it keeps offering, keeps coming back, until eventually you either accept or you find a way to block it out. How do I block it out? I asked desperately. How do I make it stop coming for me? You don't, Leo said quietly. You choose. You either accept what it's offering, or you accept what you'll lose by refusing it. There's no middle ground. There's no way to negotiate with it or send it away. You just choose. I don't want to choose. I want my life back. I want Sarah back. Sarah made her choice, Leo said. That's what I'm telling you. When the creature took her, she went willingly. Some part of her wanted to go. The crash was just the opportunity it needed. I hung up after that. I couldn't listen to any more of it. The idea that Sarah, that anyone would choose to be transformed by that thing, to have their consciousness taken and replaced with something alien, it was too much to process. But the creature, it seemed, was patient. The creature came to my apartment. I don't know how it fit through the door, or how it managed to move through the hallways without being seen. I only know that I woke up with it standing at the foot of my bed, its enormous eyes reflecting the light from the city outside my window. Its wings were folded, making it smaller than it had been on the road, but still terrifyingly large. The smell of oil and decay filled my bedroom. I tried to scream. No sound came out. My throat was locked, my body paralyzed. I could move only my eyes, and they tracked the creature as it moved closer. This is the final offering, the creature said. Its voice was less like grinding metal now and more like wind through trees, almost melodic. You have 3 choices. You can accept transformation and become new. You can refuse and live the rest of your life knowing what you rejected. Or you can try to kill me. I wanted to ask how I could possibly kill something like that. but it answered before I could speak. There are ways, specific ways. Fire burns us. Electricity disrupts us. Salt poisons us. You have the knowledge, and you have the access. If you choose, you can end this, and I will not return to you or anyone you know. But understand, that choice means living with the knowledge of what you are capable of doing. It means having taken a life, even a life that is not human. It means becoming something other than what you are now. The creature moved closer. I could see every detail now. The segmented texture of its wings, the incredible complexity of the eyes, the way its chest moved as it breathed. It was alive, truly alive, and more complex than anything I could comprehend. She sends her love, the creature said. Sarah, she asked me to tell you that she's sorry, but that she couldn't go back. She asked me to tell you that you deserve to be happy, and that she hopes you choose to be. And then it did something I didn't expect. It reached out one of its massive arms. The fingers were too long, too jointed, too wrong, and it touched my face, gently, almost tenderly. And in that moment of contact, I felt something. Not communication exactly, more like a resonance, a sense of what it would be like to see the world through those enormous eyes, to perceive colors and spectrums of light that humans couldn't even name, to fly, to be something more than limited human consciousness trapped in limited human form. The sensation lasted only a moment. Then it was gone, and the creature was moving toward the window. It opened the window with the same casual ease it might use to open a door, and then it climbed onto the fire escape. I will return in 7 days, the creature said. You will have reached a decision by then. Choose wisely, Jeremiah Cole. Choose in accordance with what you truly are. It spread its wings and flew away into the night. I spent the next 7 days in a state of existential paralysis. I couldn't work. I couldn't sleep. I could barely eat. I kept thinking about what the creature had said, about the 3 choices, about what each one would mean. If I accepted transformation, I would become something other than human. I would lose my life, my identity, everything that made me me. But I would also gain something. Sarah had experienced that, and according to Leo, his daughter experienced it, and they claimed to be happier than they'd ever been. What was humanity worth if it meant being miserable? What was identity worth if it kept you trapped in a limited suffering existence? If I refused, I would live the rest of my life knowing what I'd rejected, knowing that there was something more, something better, and that I'd chosen not to pursue it. That knowledge would poison everything. Every moment of contentment would be shadowed by the awareness of what I'd given up. And if I tried to kill the creature, I wasn't a violent person. I'd never killed anything larger than insects. The idea of trying to murder an intelligent being, even one as alien as Mothman, filled me with a horror that was almost worse than the other options. On the 6th day, I made a decision. I was going to call Leo, and I was going to ask him what he'd chosen. If he'd chosen to refuse, then maybe I could draw strength from his choice. If he'd chosen to accept, then maybe I could understand how he'd rationalize that choice. But when I called his number, it was disconnected. When I tried to access the forum where he'd posted 5 years ago, the account had been deleted. It was as if Leo Garrison had been erased from the internet, or perhaps had chosen to erase himself. By the time the 7th day arrived, I still hadn't made a decision. I spent the day in a state of anxiety so profound that I could barely function. I waited for nightfall. I waited for the creature to return. It came at exactly midnight. It landed on my bedroom balcony, a space that should have been far too small for something with a 12-foot wingspan, but the creature managed it anyway. Its wings folded at an angle that defied physics. Have you decided? It asked. I opened my mouth to speak and I realized I didn't know what to say. All 3 choices seemed impossible, but one of them had to be made. And in that moment of hesitation, I understood something. The creature wasn't asking me to choose because it cared what I chose. It was asking because the choice itself was the point. The moment of decision, the acknowledgement that I was facing something real and genuinely alien, the acceptance that the world contained mysteries that couldn't be resolved through rational analysis. That was the transformation the creature wanted. Because once you'd seen Mothman, once you'd encountered the impossible and had to choose how to respond, you could never go back. You were already changed. The choice was just the formalization of that change. I'm going to refuse, I said. I'm going to refuse your offer, and I'm going to live with that knowledge, and I'm going to find a way to make peace with it. The creature was silent for a long moment. Then it did something that I think might have been laughter. A sound like wind chimes made of bone, beautiful and horrible at the same time. A worthy choice, it said. Then I grant you one final gift." It reached out and touched my forehead. The sensation was electric, almost orgasmic, and in that moment I experienced a flash of vision. I saw Sarah as she was now, not human, but something else entirely. Something that moved through dimensions I couldn't perceive, that saw colors I couldn't name, that existed in states of being that transcended physical form, and she was happy, truly, genuinely happy. And I understood why she'd chosen transformation, because in that moment I could almost see it too. I could almost understand the appeal of being more than human, of transcending the limitations that kept people trapped in suffering. Then the vision faded, and the creature withdrew its hand. "You will carry that knowledge with you forever," it said. "You will be the barrier between your world and mine. You will see both, and belong fully to neither. This is the consequence of refusal. This is the price you pay for choice." The creature spread its wings and flew away into the darkness. I never saw it again. That was 14 months ago. I still live in Charleston. I still work the same job, though I've never been as engaged with it. I still see Officer Mitchell occasionally, and I can see in his eyes that he never believed my story, never thinks of me as anything other than a slightly unbalanced person who had some kind of psychological episode. But I know the truth. I know Mothman is real. I know that Sarah chose to become something other than human. I know that there are dimensions of existence beyond what normal human perception can access, and I know that I made a choice, and I live with that choice every single day. Sometimes, late at night, I stand on my balcony and look up at the stars. I wonder if I made the right decision. I wonder if I should have accepted the transformation, should have chosen to become something more, something better. And somewhere in the mountains I hear the sound of massive wings beating against the darkness. Mothman is still there, still moving through the hidden places of the world, still offering to those who are desperate enough or dissatisfied enough to listen. I never accepted his offer. But the offer once made never truly goes away. It echoes in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of what I rejected, a constant whisper suggesting that I still have the chance to change my mind. And maybe someday I will.